Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much, Sister Watson, Kirill. All of you, thank you so much for making it here. Long drives, long flights, connections, and so forth. This thing is miraculous that it happened. Started with like mini miracle when a year and a half ago we met Sister Vasa at one of her presentations in Greek church, and she realized that my wife Masha and I, we are on the same wavelength as far as the current events with the war. Expression in her face was as if she saw two unicorns coming out of the Rocor forest. And then it turned out that actually there's more than two. And there are people like us who feel the same way and also feel like we were being essentially gaslighted. So that's when the idea of the first gathering came about. And little by little, it crystallized into the idea that we should really support each other because we're not alone. And that clicked. We came up with that concept that we're not alone. We are not the ones who lost their minds. We're actually normal. So, and it's nice to acknowledge each other's normalcy in that sense. And Sister Vasa graciously agreed to lead that conference along with the Sergey Furmanov. And we had a 2-day conference event, one day in Russian, one day in English. And we had a very lovely gathering of people of all kinds of, all ways of life. It's amazing collection of people we had last year here. Wish you were here to see them. People who came from Ukraine, from Russia, like literally just fled on the spot. And then, of course, we had our local Orthodox who also are like-minded people. So Sister did this great presentation about the so-called traditional values and how it influenced, what role it played in forming this new ideology pro-war. Anyways, Sergey Furmanov did also a great job talking about history of Moscow Patriarchy from up to the current state of events. So on the day of conference, or the day before conference, we were all struck by this horrible news. That's when Alexei Navalny was killed. So the fact that we gathered here literally the day after was another miracle, essentially, because we're all devastated. Well, we still are, but that was a really special event, so we could all be together. And so there was literally that feeling of not being alone, but supporting each other, and learning that basically there are a lot more people who think along the same thoughts that cross the globe, not just in your local, but everywhere. It really gives us strength. That's how several months later, Sister Vasa again suggested that maybe there's something else we can do to continue supporting each other at the time when, like right now, as you all probably agree, well, at least that's how I feel, and I think Sister was in someone's mind that not that we're losing hope, but there's a sense of hopelessness kind of pervasive, and it's getting worse. 3 years into the war, everybody's getting tired. And so like there's a new low. There was a high lows. So I think we're hitting a new low now with this never-ending tragedy. So this is a perfect time to once again get together and support each other and hear great speakers, amazing speakers. So we have an opening act, Lucy Ash. You can read about her. She's absolutely has amazing background, and we can just get right into it. We're going to try to stick by the schedule, if you don't mind. Although, since we have fewer people, hopefully our discussions will be also kept on time, and we'll try to stick to the schedule. So, Lucy Ash is going to give her first talk about history of Non-Conformism is Russian Orthodoxy from Pussy Riot on. So please welcome Lucy Ash.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. And we have an expression that I was just explaining to Father Andre in England about teaching your grandmother to suck eggs. And I feel a little bit like in awe of all the expertise on orthodoxy in this room. So I hope that you will forgive the fact that I don't know as much as any of you in many ways. I've come to this subject fairly recently. The pictures are tend to keep falling off the screen. So I'll try to
Maybe if we start the presentation.
Yeah, we're just starting the presentation line.
Yeah. How do I do that?
Button that looks like a screen.
Oh, will you? Oh, great. Oh, great. Okay. So I can just move it along with that.
Yes.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, that's really good to know. Okay, well, so yeah, just very briefly, I'll tell you that I first went to Moscow when I was 15 years old, and I went swimming with my host family, they were friends of my father's, in this Basen Moskva. I had no idea at that time that it was that there was a church there before that had been blown up by Stalin and things. And I learned that as I went along. And since then, I've been covering Russia, Ukraine, and the region for almost all of my life. Since then, I was posted to Moscow in the early 1990s. So anyway, I'm going to talk quite a lot about the Pussy Riot action in some detail, and I apologize if you already know all this, but I thought it would be maybe useful. So I'm going to start this talk at the scene of the crime, as it were, which is the place where on February the 21st, 2012, Pussy Riot performed their famous punk prayer, because it's the seat of the Russian Orthodox Patriarchate and the center of Moscow's religious life. And it's not just any religious building. And although many of you are very familiar with this story, I wanted to give you a bit of context. So just upriver from the Kremlin, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, built to celebrate Russia's victory over Napoleon, was blown up by Stalin in 1931. He wanted to replace it with this ginormous palace of Soviets with a huge statue of Lenin on the top, pointing his finger upwards to the heavens. And I think his finger would have been something like 18 meters long. But it never got built because the war happened, the ground was very sort of soggy, and Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, decided that he would fill the empty crater with a swimming pool. And so around this time that I first lived in Moscow, when I was sent there by the BBC, I arrived in August 1990, just before the collapse of the USSR. There was a motley collection of Orthodox Christians and Russian nationalists. They began lobbying to get the cathedral rebuilt. I would sometimes see them walking near the swimming pool with banners, collection boxes, and things like that. Boris Yeltsin, Russia's first president, wanted the cathedral to be restored. He said to atone for the sins of the Soviet past. But not very much happened. You saw like there was a little wooden structure that was built nearby. Occasionally in the underpasses or the metro, you would see people with collection tins. But it seemed quite a sort of unlikely thing to happen until Yuri Lushkov, the mayor of Moscow, got involved, and he started twisting the arms of all the new business people, including some of the foreign brands, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, to donate money to build the cathedral if they wanted to get any business done in Moscow. That was the deal. He cut that sort of thing. And so this cathedral that had taken most of the 19th century to build was sort of constructed very quickly in about 5 years, and it became very quickly a symbol of church and state. on the very last day of 1999, the day of the political transition when Yeltsin went on TV to announce he was stepping down, Alexei II performed a small consecration of Christ the Saviour. And then he was invited to the Kremlin for the transfer of power. The new man had specifically asked for the Patriarch's blessing, the first leader to do so since Tsar Nicholas II. And this was one of the first decisions taken by a little-known former KGB officer who became president, Vladimir Putin. All of this is to say that what started as quite a grassroots initiative morphed into an undeniable symbol of church and state. There were billboards all over the country with the new cathedral with its shiny gold domes. And it was more seen as a sign of a resurgent Russia, a resurgent capitalist, shiny Russia, than a sign of the resurgent Orthodox faith. At least that's what a lot of my Orthodox friends in Moscow said to me at the time. They had trouble connecting with this building. Less than a decade later, Alexei's successor, Kirill, or Vladimir Gundyaev, to use his secular name, was enthroned as patriarch in Christ the Saviour. Extraordinary as it may seem today, some dismissed him as a zapadnik, a westernizer. Traditionalists didn't like what they saw as his ecumenical tendencies and his propensity to reach out to other faiths, especially the Catholics, like his mentor, Bishop Nicodim, who unexpectedly collapsed and died in 1978 at the feet of the Pope in Rome. And some government officials also distrusted Kirill because they remembered his role in drawing up the church's social doctrine in 2000, which decreed that the state's authority was not absolute. 100 days into his leadership of the church, the new patriarch insisted that for him, symphonia, the concept inherited from Orthodox Byzantium about the harmonious relations between church and state, meant specifically the independence of the secular and spiritual authorities from one another and their cooperation, but in no event their merger. And at times, Kirill seemed to side with Russian society at large, with impoverished Russians against the government. I remember that in March 2011, he complained about utility tariffs. He called them an outrage, and he urged people to defend their rights. He said, civil society only exists if people strive to improve life around them. And that autumn, amid the fury over election fraud, he was much more outspoken. When the presidency was passed to Medvedev and then back to Putin, as if Medvedev was just there keeping Putin's seat warm, as it were, Russians that I knew, a lot of them feared a descent into authoritarianism, and they took to the streets. And just before the demonstrations got really big, but when they were starting, the church sponsored a traveling exhibition of a famous relic, the Virgin's Belt, from a monastery on Mount Athos, and people queued for hours, even overnight, to see it. And state TV covered the event exhaustively because it was quite a convenient distraction from these growing demonstrations that were threatening Vladimir Putin and his United Russia party. But these became the biggest street protests in Moscow since the ones that I saw when I first went in the early 90s. And this was when Alexei Navalny first shot to prominence. He started calling United Russia the party of crooks and thieves. And the slogan is emblazoned on the bridge here, saying, give us back our votes. In a televised sermon on Orthodox Christmas Day, January the 7th, 2012, Patriarch Kirill said it would be a very bad sign if the authorities ignored the demonstrations. And some people even hoped to forge links with the opposition. between Navalny, who was an Orthodox believer, and the church. And I've got a friend who is a very prominent music journalist in Russia, Artemy Troitsky, and he had this idea that that maybe he could get the church on side with the demonstrators. And he was talking about Nil Sorsky, the 15th century anti-corruption campaigner, who had the movement, the Niezdizhateli, the non-possessors movement, which was opposing massive land ownership by the church. And the Patriarch's press spokesman, Vladimir Legoida, seemed to like the idea at first, because he thought it would be a positive step. It would emphasize solidarity with the people, and it would refocus on spiritual rather than material things. But after a bit of toing and froing, it was clear that all of this was not going to fly. It all came to nothing, because I think it's fair to say that early on, it was clear Patriarch Kirill was no Nil Sorsky. In the 1990s, when he ran the Department for External Church Relations, he was known as the Tabachny Metropolit, the tobacco bishop, for importing vast quantities of Marlboro and Camel cigarettes under the guise of humanitarian aid. He liked skiing in Switzerland, and he liked Swiss watches. This
Sorry.
something.
No,
Should I?
no, that was my mistake. Sorry.
Okay. There's a bit of an echo. Oh, no, it's gone. Okay. This Breguet watch that was so focused on by journalists all over the world was noticed by journalists in Kiev initially in 2009. And at that point, when he went on this tour of Ukraine, he talked a lot about Christian asceticism. He said, if the whole of society embarks on the path of unbridled consumption, then our land will not withstand it. So he was quite adept at giving lectures to people about how they shouldn't be attached to material things. Nothing happened again. This watch wasn't mentioned, but then suddenly it surfaced when he was seen wearing it in a meeting with Konovalov, the Russian justice minister. And people sort of thought, why is the Patriarch wearing such an expensive watch? So the church decided they would get rid of it with Photoshop. But the problem is they forgot to erase its reflection on a shiny table. So you can still see the reflection of the watch, even though it's not on his wrist anymore. And this was so ridiculous. It was such a kind of obvious media bungle that I thought this can't really be a mistake. I felt that maybe somebody somewhere was putting pressure on Patriarch Kirill to bring him to heel, because he started sort of facing a tide of black PR. I mean, I'm not sure that all these memes were exactly at the time of this, but this is the kind of thing that was coming out a lot. Sort of not very respectful images of him like this. And this one saying, money is a sin, I'll take all your sins upon myself. So there was, he became the butt of a lot of jokes, and there was also a big sort of scandal about his flat that was opposite the Kremlin, where there was a woman living there, Lydia Leonova. Nobody quite knew what her relationship was with the Patriarch. Apparently she was a second cousin, and they lived together as brother and sister, as in sort of like she was a nun, or that's what people were told. But it was the main scandal was that he was suing one of his neighbors who had quite advanced cancer, claiming that building work in the neighbor's flat had wrecked his very precious books. And it just didn't sit very well with his image of being a sort of forgiving Christian. So there have been sort of questions in my mind as to whether all of these scandals were sort of dredged up in a way to put some kind of pressure on him, because there was this 180-degree turn in early February of 2012, when Kirill told his flock that Orthodox people do not go to demonstrations. They stay at home and pray instead. And at this famous meeting he had with Vladimir Putin in Danilovsky Monastery, he said that Putin's presidency was a miracle from God, and a lot of other things that sounded very sycophantic. So this is what prompted Pussy Riot's famous punk prayer, and they said as much. I'm sure that you're all familiar with the chorus, which pleads with the Mother of God, Virgin Mary, to get rid of Putin. But I also wanted to focus for a moment on the first verse, which was translated in rhyming couplets by a British poet, Carol Rumans, because I believe it encapsulates the women's criticism of the Russian Orthodox Church quite well. Repressiveness, close ties to the security services, an unhealthy interest in wealth, as well as obviously homophobia and misogyny. Congregations genuflect, black robes brag gilt epaulets, freedom's phantoms gone to heaven, gay prides chained and in detention. KGB chief saint descends to guide the punks to prison vans. Don't upset his saintship, ladies. Stick to making love and babies. So they were arrested a few days later and spent 5 months in detention before their trial. We're talking about young women who had small children at home. And meanwhile, Patriarch Kirill went into overdrive. There was no question of turning the other cheek, as it were. He told Russia's chief prosecutor that the women should be investigated for extremism and demanded the maximum prison sentence for hooliganism and aggravated blasphemy. The devil has laughed at all of us, he said in a sermon shortly afterwards. We have no future if we allow mockery in front of our sacred shrines. And the women, writing to the patriarch from their prison cell, vehemently denied that their aim was to insult the Orthodox or their faith. And Masha Alyokhina is actually an Orthodox believer. They wrote, "What troubles us is that the very shrine you consider so defiled is so inseparably linked to Putin. We expressed our grief, shared with millions of Christians, that you had allowed the religion to become a weapon in a dirty political campaign, and that you had urged the faithful to vote for a person whose actions are so far removed from God's truth." At the outset, I would say, I was there quite shortly afterwards in Moscow. Very few people supported them or even understood their message about this toxic embrace of the church and the state. There was a poll done at the time that showed only 13% of people believed it was a political protest. The overwhelming majority just thought it was delinquency or blasphemy. And even the Orthodox believer Alexei Navalny dismissed the punk prayer as idiotic. But one highly respected cleric, Deacon Andrei Kurayev, was immediately on their wavelength. And much to the fury of his then boss, Kurayev argued that the church's angry reaction to the feminist punks went flat against Orthodox tradition. In his blog, he reminded the patriarch that the performance took place during Maslenitsa, a pagan holiday that was adopted by the church, and it was a time of licensed irreverence, just before Great Lent. Under Peter the Great, swearing, wearing bright colours, and performing subversive acts were part and parcel of church life. Masha Alyokhina, one of the women on trial and an Orthodox believer, said that Pussy Riot had deliberately chosen to perform during Maslenitsa, otherwise known as Butter Week. And when I went to see Kurayev, he told me that the church should have offered the performers pancakes and mead rather than punishment. He thought that they should have been invited to repent in the cathedral on the Day of Forgiveness before Lent. Instead, in August 2012, these young women with no previous convictions and with young children at home were sent to penal colonies for 2 years. Well, 2 of them were, one of them was released. Instead of their trademark fluorescent ski masks, they wear crowns of thorns, said Kuraev. In their previous incarnation, some of Pussy Riot's members belonged to the art activist group Vaina, or War. And I first met this group in 2009 because I was making a documentary about police abuse. And one member that you see here, Aliyev Varotnikov, wearing a cassock and a cross, as well as a police officer's cap, strolled into a Moscow supermarket, loaded up his basket, and walked out without paying. The funny thing is, nobody stopped him. The stunt, he told me, was to protest the fact that priests and police officers in Russia seem to be above the law. A cop in the priest's robe is like Satan, he told me. He can do whatever he likes. Another Vaina stunt was a naked orgy inside Moscow's Natural History Museum. It was designed to highlight the obscenity of fake elections in 2008, I was told, at the time when Dmitry Medvedev was handpicked by Putin to take over as president. Doubtless, many Russians found such stunts vulgar and offensive, but they echo the behavior of holy fools down the centuries. And I know this talk's supposed to be about what's going on in Russia today, but I'm going to go back a little bit, a few centuries, because they felt, the holy fools felt, it was their job to speak truth to power. Fools rely on the concept of ostranение, defamiliarization, whereby something is made to look freakish so that habitual perceptions are imbued with a refreshed moral vision. In other words, a fool enables one to look at society's values anew and to question stuff complacent people have taken for granted. Yurodstvo, the Russian word for the idea of holy foolishness for the sake of Christ. And in defense of Pussy Riot, human rights activists in Russia also cited the Yurodstvo tradition, in which holy fools were allowed to criticize their superiors, and even the Tsar. Basil the Blessed, who you can see here on the left-hand side, he went around Moscow with practically nothing on. He stole from merchants in Red Square. He threw rocks through people's windows. He was one of the very few people that Ivan the Terrible was actually terrified of. Once he went to the Kremlin and urged the Tsar to eat raw meat during Lent. And when the outraged Tsar objected, he replied, "Why abstain from meat when you murder men?" Mm-hmm. The Yurodiv's plain talking recalls straight away for me the role of Shakespeare's wise fool, who told King Lear, "Thou shouldst not have been old till thou hadst been wise, and thou hadst little wit in thy bald crown when thou gavest thy golden one away." But it's not just about sort of being truth tellers. With their tattered clothes, their hair shirts, and their chains, Russia's holy fools also embrace a radical Christ-like form of humility. I would say that the flip side of this humility is Russian exceptionalism. And it began with Filofey of Pskov, the abbot of a monastery near the border with modern-day Estonia, who wrote to his monarch, Grand Prince Vasily III, proclaiming Moscow as the Third Rome. After the fall of Rome and Byzantium, Russia, he suggested, was now this unique civilization destined to guide the world. The Christian philosopher Nikolai Berdyaev was not a great fan of this prophecy. He said it was supposed to be about an ideal partnership of church and state, a way that the church could sort of teach rulers how to behave. But instead, under Vasily III's son, Ivan the Terrible, the Moscow Orthodox kingdom became a violent totalitarian state, complete with the oprichniki, the forerunners of the secret police. And when the church is most subordinate to the state, as it is now, the greater the need for holy fools. That's according to John Saward. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, Saward or Saywood, an Oxford scholar. who made a study of them in 1980. He argued that they were essential in the 16th century to take a stand against the abuse of power and to expose the betrayal of Christian ideals. Before the consolidation of the realm of Muscovy as a proto-totalitarian state, there are many examples of churchmen and women acting as prophetic voices against the abuses of power by the princes. You think of one of the most famous cases, Metropolitan Philippe, the bishop suffocated in his prison cell for crossing Ivan the Terrible and refusing to bless him when he walked into the church. That's well known by everybody. But he is the culmination of a long line of what in Old Russian is called a pichelnik zemli ruskoy, an intercessor, literally someone who's sad for the land of Russia. And one key source is the 11th century Paterikon, a collection of biographies of local saints from the monastery of the caves in Kiev. It explicitly states that one of the duties of the abbot of a monastery is to be a pichelnik, an intercessor, before the princes and the powers that be. The heir to a medieval Russian principality had to kiss a cross held by an abbot or bishop, whose duty it was to remind the rulers of the Christian virtues of justice and mercy. And this kresnoye tselovanie was far from a formality. For example, the Kiev Metropolitan Constantine persuaded the Prince Ivan Dolgoruki to show mercy to a rival Prince Ivan Beladnik, who was spared death and allowed to live out the rest of his life in peace. The abbot Varlam of Khutin saved the life of a robber who was about to be drowned by a mob in Novgorod. Abbot Gregory of St. Andrew's Monastery in Kiev interceded with his prince not to execute a number of robbers, and in return for their lives, they were put to work on monastery lands. And then there was Abbot Dmitri, who refused to accept very lavish royal gifts of food for his monastery. And he told the prince not to give them to the monks, but to distribute them to the poor and to orphans instead. Of course, I'm not saying it would be really naive to assert that Christian virtues of mercy and forgiveness prevailed in medieval Russia, but they were by no means absent, and nor were the representatives of the church invariably supine when dealing with earthly authority. The last known example of Pechelovanie on behalf of the Russian church, which became rarer and rarer as the Muscovite state became more and more powerful, was the case of Patriarch Adrian, who implored Peter the Great to spare the lives of the Streltsy. They were the musketeers who led a rebellion against him in 1698. Peter the Great refused and had them tortured and executed in an absolutely brutal way. And to just remind you, Putin's on record as saying he's a great admirer of Peter the Great. But of course, co-opting the church for political expediency of the state is not only peculiar to Russia, because we've got our own experience in the UK of absolutist monarchs. Henry VIII springs to mind, for example. But in opposition to messianic ideas about divinely sanctioned rulers, a grassroots Holy Russia endured. This is a kind of popular religiosity outside the political establishment, and it survived in Soviet times despite unrelenting persecution. Stalin, he realized that he needed the support of the church to beat the Germans in the Second World War. And afterwards, the church was made to parrot state propaganda about the struggle for peace as the Kremlin stoked insurgencies in Africa and invaded Afghanistan. But whatever sort of rubbish was said in public, if you like, when I first visited Russia, the inner life of the church was hidden from most people's experience. Young people were not encouraged to go to services. I tried to go to the Easter liturgy in one church, and I was sent packing by some men in red armbands who told me to go and watch TV instead. So the church was almost like a sort of secret, not like the catacomb church, in the terrible years of the Great Terror, but there was something secret about it, existed quietly with no overt claims on any all-embracing ideological truth. Instead, it felt as if a lot of the people that I knew that went to church drew on its 1,000-year-old liturgical and artistic traditions, and they were very keen to educate me about icons and about music, but I'm at a very low level. I want to know more. The quite austere to someone brought up with Church of England teachings of the Orthodox Church were not really kind of thrust down your throat. There was something to be embodied, something to be aspired to in your day-to-day private life. But in no way was there any sense that it should be imposed on society like some kind of ideology. In some places, this grassroots Holy Russia is still alive and kicking, despite the best efforts of the Moscow Patriarchate, telling the faithful what they should think and how they should pray. A vocal minority of Russia's 40,000 priests truly do back the war in Ukraine. The majority keep their heads down, fearful of losing their jobs. And a courageous few play the role of holy fools or truth tellers. So I'm talking about priests like Father Ioan Koval, who replaced the word victory, just one word, with the word peace in a prayer and was defrocked as a result. Patriarch Kirill had demanded that his victory prayer be read during liturgies across Russia and further afield. And if Rock churches abroad could sometimes get away with not reading the prayer, inside Russia, punishment was swift. I'm not going to talk about this very much, about what happens to clergy who openly oppose the war, because right opposite me is Father Andrei Kordochkin, is far better placed to do that. And he's going to tell you, I'm sure, later about the group he set up to support them. I want to go back to Pussy Riot for a minute. On their release from prison, Masha Alyokhina and Nadia Dolokonikova used their experiences and their global fame to campaign for more humane conditions for all the thousands, tens of thousands of Russians behind bars. So they set up Zona Prava and a media project. And in 2017, I made a radio documentary comparing people who had recently left Russia with the people who had fled 100 years before, straight after the Bolshevik Revolution. And I didn't just want to talk to the people that had moved to Berlin or New York or Paris or London. I wanted to talk to people that had stayed in Russia and find out why they'd stayed. And I spoke to Nadia, and she told me categorically that there was no way that Putin was going to force her out of her own country. She felt very strongly about that. She said she had a lot of interesting work to do in prison reform. She was very excited about, refocusing the direction of Russian journalism, doing more things in the provinces, and training like young activists. But times have changed, and an authoritarian regime has morphed into fascism. Putin doesn't kiss the cross and promise to rule with mercy. Instead, he inscribes his initials on crosses that are sent to the frontline troops in Ukraine and tells his obedient patriarch to bless them. And I feel just in conclusion that the writing was on the wall in the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour. Holy fools can be pranksters, but they can also be clairvoyants. And I felt that Pussy Riot were both of those things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Lucy Ash. We do have time for questions for Lucy. And because we didn't quite hear more about Lucy before her talk, I just wanted to say a few words about Lucy, who's a friend of mine already for several years. I'm honored to say she happens to be an award-winning journalist from the United Kingdom with a lifelong interest in Russian history. Lucy speaks Russian a little bit with a British accent, but my Russian is also not completely free of certain foreign infection. She studied at the Sorbonne Nouvelle, New College, Oxford, and City University of University School of Journalism. For 4 years in the early 90s, from 1990 to 1994, Lucy lived in Moscow, where she ran the bureau of BBC Radio. And during the turbulent years of post-Soviet Russia, she reported for the BBC and also for Scotland on Sunday. I'm just mentioning a few of the things in Lucy's very impressive CV. Her recently published book, The Baton and the Cross, explores the Russian Orthodox Church's relationship with the state down the centuries and today under Putin. Her other work can be found at her website. So, Lucy, thank you very much for crossing the ocean for this conference. So now we do have time for questions and comments. So don't be shy, please, because we know you're going to come up to Lucy privately later.
Yeah, no,
Shy types, and want to have her personally respond to your questions. But stay tuned, those of you watching at home, because coming up is the talk of none other than Father Cyril Hovorun. So stay tuned for that.
yeah. Does anyone have any questions?
Sure.
I'm very-
What are they now? Nadia, Marta, Yochim.
Well, Masha Alyokhina had to leave Russia sort of in quite a big hurry. And she disguised herself as a food delivery driver. And I think she crossed the border in Narva into Estonia. And I after that, she went to Canada. And the last thing I heard about Nadia is that she was in California. But to be honest, I ought to kind of talk to them again and find out what they're doing right now. I think a lot of people feel very disorientated and quite unsure what to do at the moment. It's a very tough time. You know, for people that were very optimistic about making Russia a better place to live, it's very hard. Because I think a lot of friends of mine who are human rights activists or they're journalists, they can't go back. Even one friend of mine, his father is the founder of the Russian internet, or the Soviet internet, and he's been he's not very well, and he's been put in a prison colony, and his son can't go back and see him. And there are lots of stories like this. You know, families separated, but also people that had a great mission to do things and achieve things in Russia. It's hard now for them. Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Feel free not to answer it. I'm sure that you receive a lot of feedback on your book, Baton and the Cross. And I wonder if you receive any feedback from the people whom you have criticized. I mean, from the Russian Orthodox Church. It could be maybe official, not official. What sort of feedback you get from them?
No, I'm really curious about the feedback. The first person that asked me about it was a monk that I met on at the Valam monastery in Lake Ladoga, and we became quite friendly. I was doing a program there that wasn't specifically about the church. It was about Tchaikovsky trying to get some inspiration to write his first symphony, and a friend of his said that going and seeing the monks on Valam would really help. So he went there in the 1880s, and the monks were demonstrating their special kind of Valamsky chant, Pienie, yeah. And so we got talking, and then it turned out that one of the monks who'd been demonstrating the singing used to be a jazz musician. They all had kind of quite interesting lives before they entered the monastery. And then another one had actually been a DJ, and he knew all these songs and things. He really surprised me with this kind of encyclopedic knowledge of kind of independent rock music. So he asked me for it. I said, well, I could try and mail it to you. He said, no, just send me the PDF. So I did, but I haven't heard anything more from him. I've offended a friend of mine in Yaroslavl who's very upset by it. She just says, like, how can you throw dirt on our patriarch? It's like really painful for me. I thought you were my friend. Why did you do this? You know, as Orthodox Christians, we have to look up to our patriarch. And I said, look, I'm sorry if I've offended you, but you know, I feel very strongly about this as well. So those kind of reactions, but I haven't had any official response from anyone that I've approached in the Moscow Patriarchate, and I thought that I might get some response, possibly. Well, I don't know. Maybe I ought to try and send them copies.
You're already blacklisted.
No, I mean, I think seriously, I think the person that might really kind of have something important and interesting to say about it is Hilarion, because I met him after he'd been moved to Budapest. He told me, you know, because he wasn't enthusiastic enough about the war. There are other reasons why he might have been sent there, I guess. But yeah, I'd quite like to know what he makes of it. So I might send him a copy to Karlovy Vary. Yeah.
So I kind of riffing off Kirill's question. I'm wondering what kind of response. It's a broad question, of course, but what kind of responses were you getting on your book in the UK, especially considering the relationship between church and state in England, which is quite different and very established and has, you know, a very different kind of tension.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think most people in the UK, like lots of people everywhere, were completely flabbergasted that they had the head of a church that was not only not calling for peace, but sort of seemed to be actively sort of cheerleading the war. So that most of the comments were about that. You know, people were sometimes you know, didn't realize the history of the church in Russia, so they were quite interested in that. Like different people bringing up different things, but I would say the overwhelming reaction was that they wanted to know why Patriarch Kirill was so beholden to the Kremlin and why he didn't sort of express any compassion for all the people that have been slaughtered in this horrible war, and why, you know, he couldn't sort of be more of a peacemaker. That was the main thing. Yeah.
I was wondering, since you mentioned Metropolitan Hilarion, I thought you went easy on him in your book, because there are a lot of stories about him. And I was wondering if you think that everything that he's been accused of is a fabrication.
No, I don't think it's a fabrication. Definitely not. I've actually talked to the young Japanese subdeacon who was working for him. I met that young man when I went to interview him in Budapest. And it just so happened that I was in Tokyo over Christmas, so I went to talk to him. I don't think so. I mean, this story emerged after I'd kind of sent him my manuscript.
Okay, then I apologize.
But yeah, I mean, I think that there are many questions, many questions about what he was doing in Hungary, why he was given a passport within a matter of weeks, lots of sort of irregularities. But I don't have hard facts about you know, whether money was channeled through the church diocese there, or but you know, I would say that there are many questions about the relationship between Hungary and the EU, and the fact that Hungary also sort of blocked the European Union's attempt to get Kirill put under sanctions. So lots of things to talk about there. Yes.
So not having read your book yet, but based on your talk, two questions actually. I guess there's two ways to interpret Patriarch Kirill's sort of life trajectory. One of which sees him as a KGB agent from of old, and you know he's just sort of fulfilling what he was trained for. But the way you presented it is something rather different, which is also the way I've understood it, which is that you know, people. I mean, Chapnin told me this, that when he was elected patriarch, people like Chapnin himself supported Patriarch Kirill because he seemed to be the more open, the more progressive among the candidates. And as you said, in January 2012, he makes that statement about they should listen to the protesters. And then all of a sudden, there's this dramatic turn. And from the moment he makes that, from the Pussy Riot onward, right, he's just lock in step with Putin. And so I'm wondering if you can say more about explaining that change in Patriarch Kirill, and maybe they had some dirt on him that they were using, or I don't know. And then the second question, although, well, the second one, less a question actually, but something to think about Pussy Riot. So you sort of do the Yurodivy and the Holy Fools and things like that, which of course had a place in medieval Russia in a context of a Russian Orthodox culture. But in the 21st century, when you had the intervening century of the Soviet Union, where the anti-religious activists used to mock the church in these public displays, for a Russian seeing that, which is that going to resonate with? That medieval history of the Holy Fools, or that, you know, 20th century history of these anti-Soviet mockery?
Absolutely, yeah, no, which is why I totally understand why it was a struggle for people to understand what the point of them doing this act in the cathedral was. I mean, lots of people said to me, like, well, why didn't they just do it somewhere else? You know, why did they have to kind of insult Orthodox believers? And because of that long history of persecution of the church in the Soviet period. But going back to the question about Kirill, I'm not the most qualified person to talk about that. I think that Cyril Hovorun is, because he worked with him closely. But the impression I get was, you know, just from various people that had met him. I talk in my book about a service in Smolensk in 1999 that we did a Sunday worship from there on the BBC, and Bordeaux went there, you know, who set up the Keston Centre in Oxford. And he's sadly no longer alive to talk to about it, but he wrote about it a lot. And he kind of understood straight away that he was dealing with someone who was a very talented businessman, very interested in running things and managing things, and very interested in making money. But you know, there were also signs that, you know, the fact that he collaborated with the KGB, a lot of people were forced to do that if they wanted to go abroad. And, you know, it's not like, the thing that is damning is that so few people, only one bishop who's now just died recently from Vilnius, admitted that he worked with the KGB and spoke about it openly. But most people in the church didn't. And well, you know the story that about it. But I think that he obviously had a lot of talent as a public speaker. He had a way of engaging with people that maybe hadn't thought about being Orthodox Christians before. You know, he gave sermons at rock concerts, and he did all sorts of reaching out initiatives. I think that he was interested in education, which is what Hovorun told me. You know, that he wanted to import some of the best practice ideas that he picked up from abroad and bring them into Russia. He wanted people to have a much deeper understanding of holy texts and the Bible, because when I first moved to Russia, people were kind of getting baptized at the rate of knots. You know, I spoke to a friend of mine at the BBC. Her dad is actually a priest outside Moscow, and he was talking about you know, just these long queues of people that were just kind of desperate to get baptized. People wanted to get married in church, but they didn't really know very much of the context that they were getting into. So I think he had lots of good reflexes and ideas, and you know, very dynamic person, not a traditionalist, but he kind of went over to the dark side, and I don't know what kind of pressure was put on him, but I feel some pretty heavy pressure was put on him by people that are close to Putin to toe the line. And I think that he operates in a climate of fear. And I feel like fear is kind of what is the most powerful thing in Russia in a way at the moment. You know, it seems to dictate a lot of behavior. Yes.
You have the photograph of Kirill and Putin.
Yeah.
Is this, I don't look for it right now, so I don't know, but is this what Russian people are seeing? Is them kind of working together? Is this an image from the?
Oh yeah,
media?
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, this was on Christmas Day, I think, wasn't it? It was the all services in the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour are televised, and you know, because it's the main church of the Moscow Patriarchate. There's a lot of footage of them working together. Putin giving the Patriarch bunches of white flowers on his birthday. You know, the two men sort of putting their heads together and having some sort of very intense conversation. There's like, you know, if you look on the website of the Moscow Patriarchate, there's just like hundreds and hundreds of photographs of them doing things together. So yeah, they are sort of in lockstep. It feels like.
That kind of makes it less likely to be a fear, isn't it? Then mutually really agreeable kind of a coexistence relationship there. Because fear actually sort of excuses him almost, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I'm sort of wondering like why I don't know. He like, can I just tell you how I felt that I didn't actually see him? I thought I was going to see him. But in this was a Congress of Orthodox Journalism in the autumn of 21. We were told to go to most of the conference was in a hotel near the airport, but we were told that we were going to have an audience with him on the Friday in the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour. And because it was kind of COVID times, he didn't come in person. He was on a big screen. But I just felt there was something about him that was so miserable. I can't kind of quite put my finger on it, and maybe this is
That's just the way Russians express happiness.
No, maybe this is ridiculously subjective, but and there was and we were talking. One of the priests from somewhere in the provinces mentioned as there'd been 2 school shooting incidents in Russia quite close together, and he asked about that and what should priests say to their flock to reassure them, and why did the patriarch think that this was happening, and he sort of explained that it was just an inevitable part of westernization and globalization rather, and you know, that's some bad ideas kind of spread to Russia from other parts of the world. But nothing unusual about that. What struck me as unusual is he didn't say a single, normally in that situation, there'd be a few words, even if they were just cursory words of sympathy for the families. Nothing like that at all. So I was just, there was a kind of coldness about him, but there was also a kind of, he just looked depressed.
If I may, I'd like to get your reaction to what I actually see as an alternate, slightly alternate version of this, and that is that it's kind of knowing the history and being one of the people who argued terribly with my friends in Russia, including Chapin, when Kirill was elected, and they were all so happy that a progressive was elected. And I said, okay, you're elected a KGB disciple of Nikodem Brotov. You can't expect anything good. So my theory actually, is that he made a play, and of course, Father Kirill react to that as well. I think he made a play for being a Russian Pope, in a sense of putting the church, the primate of the church, above the state. A play for the conscience of the people. And I think that because just as his teacher, Bishop Nikodem, he was very fascinated with Rome and the position of, and a completely different dynamic in, Roman versus the state. And I think he made that play and lost and was brought to heel. So I agree with you that he was brought to heel.
But you think
I just think I have zero illusions about his about the benign motives of his progressivism. I think he was this was a way to get to that level of power.
Well, I'm not sure if I thought that he was benign. It was more that he seemed like somebody who was independent and who was dynamic.
Yeah, in that with that I would agree. I just think that was his again, just putting him in the context of his history.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Just maybe one more question. Lucy, do you feel safe to travel to Russia now as a Western journalist critical of the Kremlin?
No, I don't think it would be a very good idea. I mean, we've seen what happened to Evan Gershkovich, and I'm the kind of journalist that doesn't really like sticking around in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I like going to sort of quite remote regions, and I think that possibly that's not the greatest idea. I was very keen to take part in an NGO in Russia called Общее Дело that rebuilds or tries to save the wooden church architecture of the Russian North, which is beautiful, but like very falling apart. So they, a priest in Moscow sort of started this thing about 20 years ago, and it's now, they have several groups that go out every summer to go camping and sort of try to restore these buildings. And I'd applied to go, and they said I could come and everything, but I had to go on a tourist visa rather than a media visa, and I thought that was maybe not a very good idea because I wasn't really a tourist. So I thought they might think I'm there under false pretenses.
When was the last time you were in Russia?
In October 21, so quite a while ago. And I don't actually, in truth, know when I'm going to be able to go back. I mean, I haven't been blacklisted or anything. There are journalists that write much ruder things about Russia than me. But I feel like at the moment it doesn't really matter what you write anyway. I think it's just that Westerners are seen as, convenient hostages that you can trade for. So it's probably not a very great time to go over there.
Become a currency, right?
Yeah, become a currency. Yeah, and I don't think my price is that high, but I don't want to be traded.
Thank you.
So thank you so much to Lucy. We have just under 10 minutes because I see that the coffee cups have arrived. If anybody's interested in coffee, we have just under 10 minutes. And there are refreshments. Thank you to those who provided them, Natalie, Masha, Sergey. And like I said, stay tuned. In just under 10 minutes, we will have the introduction of Father Cyril Hovorun and his talk. So
There's coffee and tea and hot water.
coffee,
and
tea,
that's-
water, and snacks of all sorts.
Bathroom is outside to the left.
So we're back after a brief coffee break, and I would like to introduce our next speaker, Archimandrite Father Cyril and Professor Father Cyril Hovorun, who is a professor of ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism at Sankt Ignatius College at the University College of Stockholm. And he's a director of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. And I'd also like to thank that institute and Father Cyril for financing the overseas travels of most of our speakers. He also helped us to cover some of the accommodations of our very wonderful lineup of speakers. So thank you to Father Cyril for that. Father Cyril is an international fellow at Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at the University of Alberta in Canada. He is also an invited professor at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and he's the guest professor at the Institute of Sino-Christian Studies in Hong Kong. So please welcome Father Cyril, and his paper is entitled The Evolution of Christian Non-Conformism.
Well, thank you, Sister Vasa, for your kind words. It's also a privilege to be here. And when I was coming here to Chicago, I thought, thanks goodness, I will not have to speak about either Putin or Kirill or Trump, as I am doing, well, since recently, especially about Trump. And actually, I see that, yes, we are talking about them, but I will not be talking about them in my presentation. So I decided to stick to my decision not to talk about them. Also, I decided not to make any presentation, so I'll be just talking. And I hope you will, you could follow me. What I'll be speaking about is somehow consistent with the period we are in Great Land. I'll be speaking about monasticism. Very unusually for me to speak about monasticism, but I thought it is appropriate to speak about this when it comes to non-conformism, because I think the main virtue of monasticism is not really not to have sex, but the main virtue is to be non-conformist, to stick to Christ's words that his kingdom is not of this world. However, before speaking about monasticism, we need to go back to the Jewish roots of the Christian non-conformism. Less than a century before Christ was born, Rome had finally conquered Judea. Roman authorities ruled it either through their local proxies, such as the Herodian dynasty, or directly through procurators. The Jews regularly rebelled against Roman rule. Their anti-Roman non-conformism framed the mission of Christ. Many of those who perceived him as the Messiah wanted him to be their king. At the same time, some of those who were against him provoked him to demonstrate his loyalty to the Roman state, to accuse him of treachery. Christ had to disappoint the former and deal with the latter. He made it clear that his kingdom, as I said, is not of this world. At the same time, he urged to give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. Christ effectively made the religion he preached neither confronting nor conforming with politics, but transcending it. He introduced a radical differentiation between religion and politics. Actually, I believe that we can speak about religion and politics as two different things owing to Christ. What he said was unprecedented for his time. And such a differentiation became a basis for the early Christian non-conformism. And I believe Christ led this non-conformist revolution. He was really a revolutionary in this particular sense of confronting this tradition, a traditional value of the Greek and Roman world, that religion and politics are always together. Christianity emerged during the period when the Roman state turned from republic to empire, something which is usually unnoticed by the church historians. But I think it is important to understand as a context of the emergence of Christianity that the republic was becoming an empire. Rome was busy substituting its horizontal republican structures with vertical monarchical ones, while Christianity developed horizontal networks. Well, if you compare Trump's America, well, probably it's something not very dissimilar. Early Christian theologians, particularly Origen, emphasized freedom as the basis of spiritual life. Rome, in contrast, advanced in coercion as its new traditional value. So coercion became really a Roman traditional value. Notwithstanding their differences, the Roman Empire followed the Roman Republic in treating politics and religion as inseparable. From this perspective, Roman society was not different from any ancient society. At the same time, the Republic and the Empire differed in their approach to state-religion relations. In the Republican period, the Roman authorities usually sought public consent for many religious practices. It was not exactly freedom of consciousness in the modern sense, but some sort of freedom regulated by Republican institutions such as the Senate. Imperial Rome, however, demanded from its subjects more conformity in religious matters. It became a rule that monarchs regulated religious beliefs, implementing the principle cuius regio eius religio. Such a role was instituted in the official function of the highest priest, Pontifex Maximus. The Senate usually approved without further question the religious initiatives of a monarch. Religious conformism thus became one of the pillars of the Pax Romana. In contrast to Roman conformism, the original Christian attitude to the state was non-conformist. Christianity, at least in its initial intentions, supported the idea of freedom of consciousness, again to the extent that was imaginable at the time. The freedom was crucial for the survival of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Without the freedom of consciousness, Christianity did not have many chances to compete with the state religion or numerous philosophical schools, which often were also religious sects. The main challenge that early Christians faced, with which they could not find a compromise, was established polytheism and imperial cult. Actually, I came to believe after studying, this imperial cult in the Roman Empire, I came to believe that that was the most important part of the Roman religion. Not polytheism, not believing in many gods, but actually believing in the imperial figure as divine. Gods were optional in this Greco-Roman religion. Emperor was never optional. So it was up to you whether you believe in Zeus, Jupiter, or Vesta, or whomever else you wanted to believe. Your choice, but it's not your choice when it came to believing in the divine character of the imperial power. So I believe that this imperial cult really constituted the core of the Greco-Roman religion. It was, of course, articulated and imposed by the imperial authorities, and the church primarily confronted this cult more than any other religious tenets. In addition to the imperial cult, the early Christian church faced some other traditional Roman values. I call them, sorry for stealing this term from the Patrick, and I like to apply it to different contexts. Particularly, it is applicable to the Roman context. And among those traditional Roman values were, for example, patriarchal virility of man and submissive procreativity of women. All women had to give sons, preferably, and unpreferably daughters to their husbands. All men were expected to have an active sexual life as a demonstration of their virility, which was not necessarily confined to the family. Anyways, not having sexual life was very un-Roman. Rome allowed female, but not male virginity, only for the servants of the goddess of health, Vesta. Even the Vestals, however, after their tenure expired, were allowed to have sex. Christians who took lifelong vows of chastity defied the Roman traditional values, which also included treating political authority as divine. Thus, Vestals, through serving their goddess, in contrast to the Christian virgins, served Rome. So Vestals are not exactly as nuns, because the main purpose of the Vestals is to serve Rome more than to serve Vesta. And they became one of the centerpieces of the imperial cult, thus. In contrast to them, early monastics defied the assumed divine character of the imperial authority, even after the latter became Christian, as we will see shortly. My point is that even the virtue of virginity, which is associated with the Orthodox monasticism, is not purely ascetical, it's also political. It was a kind of defilement, it was a rejection of the Roman values, imperial values, I mean, the political values of the Roman Empire. Another traditional Roman value, which early Christians and early monasticism intended to defy, was hierarchism. Roman society was intrinsically hierarchical. Social hierarchies were believed to be embedded in the very human nature, as Aristotle had suggested. So it's a very Aristotelian idea, the ontologization of the social strata, of the social statuses. According to Aristotle's ontology, when someone was a slave, for example, slavery was in this person's nature. That person could not be non-slave. And this ontology became fully materialized in Roman society, which institutionalized social distances as both ontological and juridical. Therefore, when Paul proclaimed, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus, his claim was very un-Roman and defied Romans' the most traditional values, because essentially Paul blasted these ontological frameworks that really shaped the Roman society, that were embedded in the Roman society. In the beginning, the church resisted the Roman hierarchism, but eventually gave up and adopted most of it. Although it did not accept the Aristotelian theory behind societal stratifications, it compromised on their practices. As a result, for example, slavery became acceptable by the church. And we know, for example, that even such open-minded and Christian spirits as Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory the theologian, he had slaves until his death, and only he released his slaves only upon his death, some of them. Some of them, he made them deacons. Since then, probably deacons became almost like slaves.
That's what's behind the
Right. Anyways, slavery became acceptable by the church in one or another way. Monasticism, however, continued resisting both the theory and practice of Rome's social stratification. In the Egyptian desert, for example, slaves became free and equal with former aristocrats. Therefore, Richard Paul Bajone is right that early monasticism, I quote him, was the most popular and vital lay movement of its day. It was really anti-hierarchical in the beginning. It was really for the lay people, for the value of being just a simple person, just for a person to be him or herself. Eventually, however, the egalitarian ethos became weakened even in monasticism. Hierarchism gradually became a norm, as it had become a norm earlier in the wider church. Writings of a Syrian monk who called himself Dionysius the Areopagite, whom I really dislike, confirmed the change through a theory that there is a heavenly hierarchy, which the earthly hierarchs must imitate. From a vessel of egalitarianism, monasticism turned to a vessel of hierarchism. Only some rudiments of the former have survived in this vessel. For example, when in the relatively recent past, bishops or even patriarchs retired to Mount Athos, and I mean primarily the patriarchs of Constantinople, but also other churches like Alexandria or Antioch. And they retired to Mount Athos or other communities, monastic communities. They sometimes abstain from performing any sacred service and live there as unordained monks. If you would go, for example, in the 18th century, I studied this Kalibadic movement in Greece in the 18th century, and many patriarchs, because the Ottomans, they just switched them all the time. Every 2 years or even more frequently, they had another patriarch. So when they would dump the previous patriarchs, they would go to Mount Athos. It was like a huge dump height, with the patriarchs and metropolitans. And when they went there, they didn't behave as patriarchs. They behaved, well, the best of them behaved as, simple monks. And they didn't even celebrate liturgy. They didn't even, confess people. They just lived as monks there. And that is, I believe that was like a rudiment of this old anti-hierarchical monastic spirit that still exists on Mount Athos, I believe, together with many other strange things. Early monastic communities were probably the only place where women felt like man, equal to man. In Egypt, which continues to be a very patriarchal society, and we should understand that in the time of the emergence of monasticism, Egypt was still very patriarchal. It is still now, but even more it was then. And imagine that in this context of a very rigidly, excruciatingly patriarchal society, monastic communities emerged where all of a sudden women became like men. Unimaginable. And we take it for granted, but think about this. It was not granted, it was not given, it was really a countercultural thing. I believe it was like a continuation of this Christ's non-conformist revolution that he started. In contrast to the larger society in Egypt, Amas enjoyed equal authority with Abbas. Still, modern convents are the only place in the Eastern churches where women may have a sort of hierarchical rank, that of an abbess. At least in the Greek world, the installation of abbesses is similar to the enthronement of hierarchs. They're even allowed to wear pictorial crosses on their chest, as priests do, as Matushka does. And this is exactly a token of this egalitarian spirit in the church that survived through monasticism. In the Roman context, egalitarianism and chastity were closely connected with non-conformism. Together, they constituted the most important features of the early monastic movement. Many Christians who later were called monks adopted an un-Roman lifestyle the un-Roman lifestyle of abstaining from sexual intercourse and treating all human beings equally because they wanted to defy what they regarded as the kingdom of Antichrist. Arguably, for some early monks, defying the Roman lifestyle and mentality was as important as keeping the vows of chastity or obedience. The non-conformist anti-imperial ethos can be seen particularly clearly in the apophthegmata, stories from the Egyptian desert. A story of Abba Moses set an example. Since we are in the Lenten period, let me quote apophthegmata. The governor of a province once heard of Abba Moses, and off he went to Skid to see him. When some folk reported the matter to the elder, he got up to run away into the marsh, but they met him and said, "Tell us, old man, where is Abba Moses' cell?" "What do you want from him?" he said to them. "He is crazy." Well, probably they were not surprised because they knew a lot of crazy monks at the time, so it was not unusual. They were not surprised indeed. And they just, when the governor, the story continues, when the governor came into the church, he said to the clergy, "I'm hearing things about Abba Moses and have come to see him and here an old man who was going into Egypt met us. We said to him, 'Where is Abba Moses' cell?' And he said to us, 'What do you want from him? He's crazy.' The clergy were sad when they heard this. They said, 'What sort of a person was this old man who said these things against the Holy One?' He was elderly, wearing old clothes, stale and black. they said, and the clergy said, that is Abba Moses. He said those things so he would not meet you. The governor went his way, having reaped a great benefit. Well, can you imagine a normal monk nowadays avoiding a governor, a person with political authority and money in this way? I cannot. And I've seen a lot of them, including myself. I would not avoid such a person. Monk demonstratively ignored and even humiliated imperial officials, in contrast to their contemporary church hierarchs who flirted with them, like in another story from Apophthegmata. The blessed Archbishop Theophilus of Alexandria once visited Arsenius together with an official, and he asked the elder if they might hear a saying from him. After remaining silent for a while, the elder answered him, "If I say something to you, will you observe it?" They agreed to observe it. Then the elder said to them, "Wherever you hear Arsenius is, do not come near." These stories were conceptualized by Athanasius of Alexandria in the life of Antony, which can be seen as a manifesto of the early monastic non-conformism. As Raymond van Dam noticed, this treatise, and I like this really like this observation, this treatise was written as an implicit response to Eusebius's Life of Constantine. So basically, the latter, Life of Constantine by Eusebius, was a manifesto of Christian non-conformism. Look at our great emperor. He is the model for everyone, for all of us. Athanasius instead promoted Antony as a protagonist of Christian non-conformism. He essentially said like this: look, don't look at this crazy Eusebius and his Constantine. Athanasius had troubles with Constantine's son, Constantius II. He essentially said, the emperor is not a model. This is the model, Antony. This is what you need to follow. There is a story from the Coptic version of Vita Antoni that contraposes Antony to Constantine very clearly, more clearly than even in the Greek texts, because Copts at that time were quite non-conformist. They retained this non-conformist spirit more than the Byzantine monks. Let me tell you this story again as a Lenten reading from Antony's life in the description of Athanasius. Antony's fame, even though it's heretical, it's Coptic, don't mind. I joke. Antony's fame reached the emperors. When the emperor Constantine and Constantius, the evil one, and Constans heard of these things, they wrote to him as our father and asked to receive letters from him. But the letters did not trouble Antony, and he did not rejoice over the emperor's letters, but remained just as he was before the emperors wrote to him. When he received the letters, he summoned the monks and said to them, "Why are you so amazed that the emperor has written us? He too is a person. Instead, be more amazed that God has written his law for us and has spoken to us through his son." Therefore, Antony did not want to receive the letter, saying, "I do not know how to write," which was probably true. The monks encouraged him, saying, "They are Christians." Well, they always found the way to explain why they need to appease, the people in authority. Well, they're also Christians. Do not annoy them, so they take offense. Then he allowed the letters to be read, and he wrote to the emperors as their equal. That is the wording from the Coptic life. We don't find the same wording in the Greek life. By telling this story, Athanasius promoted egalitarianism and non-conformism as the two pillars of early monasticism. He stressed the former by presenting Antony as treating the emperors as equal to other Christians, and the latter by emphasizing Antony's refusal even to open the imperial letters, which was very non-conformist, which was really defying the imperial authority. The non-conformist monastic ethos contributed to the church's crisis and helped resolve them. Both, it's just how they use it. Thus, the majority of monastic communities in Egypt and Syria resisted the Chalcedonian orthodoxy, which was enforced by the empire. For them, this orthodoxy was conformism. Was this the opposite to what they believed? The Chalcedonian orthodoxy was conformist, and they considered it as the monastic duty to reject it as polluted by the interference of the state. For this reason, they endorsed anti-Chalcedonians and not Chalcedonians. They called the Chalcedonians Melkites, that is, king's people. To stress their disdain for the Chalcedonian collaborators with the state, the anti-Chalcedonians called their opponents Chalcedonians. And here is my discovery. I made it when I studied the term Chalcedonian, because we call them ourselves Chalcedonians. We say we are Chalcedonians. But the Chalcedonians in the period of Chalcedon never called themselves Chalcedonians. And that really, that was an enigma for me. I couldn't understand why it was so. And then I speculated, and here is my speculation. So indeed, initially the term Chalcedonians in the text that I searched, in Greek, these words are like Chalcedoni or Chalcedonei, meant those from the polis of Chalcedon on the Asian shore of Bosphorus, just opposite to Byzantium. Leontius of Byzantium, for example, referred to the Council of Constantinople in 453 as the one of the Chalcedonians, kata in Chalcedoneon. But by the Chalcedonians, he meant not his fellow Diophysites, but those from the neighborhood across the Bosphorus. Apparently, Leontius used the local word, a sort of slang, by which the dwellers of Chalcedon were known to their neighbors as Chalcedonei. And apparently the Byzantini, the Byzantines, were those who lived on the opposite side of Bosphorus. And as all neighbors, they didn't really trust each other and didn't like each other. And they coined different pejorative terms for each other. So the Byzantines coined this word Chalcedonians for those who dwelt over there, on the other side of Bosphorus. According to the available sources that I looked into, at least, the Chalcedonians, in the sense of Diophysites, did not call themselves Chalcedonians, as I said. In contrast to them, those whom we call anti-Chalcedonians use the word Chalcedonians as a label for us. So it was like a shame at the time to be called a Chalcedonian. And now we enjoy it. We have Syriac sources speaking of the Chalcedonians, literally. At that time, Chalcedon was a relatively small suburb of the capital, Epolis, their city, which implied anything associated with it as small-sized, particular, and secondary to the mainstream, a sort of sidekick. Those were the features that the Miaphysites ascribed to the Diophysites. They were an insignificant party that tried to make their big brother, the court, happy. To be a Chalcedonian to the monastic non-conformists in Egypt and Syria meant to be a sellout, a collaborator. Monastic communities of Upper Egypt, guided by Archimandrite Shenouda the Great, constituted the core of the non-Chalcedonian, anti-Chalcedonian movement. Together with the Archbishop of Alexandria, Cyril, Shenouda had participated in the Council of Ephesus in 431. Later, he allied with Archbishop Dioscoros, and his monastery became a hotbed of the anti-Chalcedonian resistance in Egypt. His reputation as a holy man, I believe he was more crazy than a holy, but anyways, many people believe he was a holy. Both things are possible, actually. They don't contradict each other. And, I don't speak about the fools for Christ because they were not crazy. They were holy, not crazy. I'm speaking about others who are both holy and crazy. So his reputation as a holy man, as a prophet, contributed to making anti-Chalcedonianism a part of the Coptic psyche and identity. In Palestine, monks revolted against the Bishop of Jerusalem, Juvenal, after he had signed the Chalcedonian Oros. He had to flee from his see to save his life. He was reinstated to his office only with the military support from the government, which added to the non-conformist resentment from the anti-Chalcedonians. In contrast to Egyptian monasticism, the Palestinian monks and nuns did not resist the Chalcedon for long. Soon, most monastic communities around Jerusalem switched to the Diophysite side. To this day, they remain a pro-Chalcedonian enclave among the Syrian anti-Chalcedonian majority. The Chalcedonian party had its own monastic supporters, even if they constituted a minority. In addition to the Palestinian monks, it enlisted Pachomian communities in Egypt and monasteries on the Sinai Peninsula. So it was like a triangle of Chalcedonian monasticism in Sinai. The monastery of sleepless monks in Constantinople became a pillar of this party. This community was established in the 420s. Its founder, Alexander, brought to Constantinople the traditions of Syriac asceticism. He introduced a practice of non-stop worship by rotating groups of monks. From the perspective of the anti-Chalcedonian party, monasticism saved faith from the Chalcedonian compromises with Nestorianism. Since then, monasticism has occupied a central place in the Coptic and Syriac traditions. From the Byzantine perspective, however, monasticism contributed to the chaos and the eventual schism within Eastern Christianity. Probably because of such perception, the Council of Chalcedon tried to discipline monastic communities by placing them under stricter episcopal authority. 3 centuries later, Chalcedonian monasticism contributed to overcoming the iconoclastic crisis. The latter had been caused by a violent interference of the state in the matters of the church and theology. Many hierarchs then confirmed with the interference, but not many monks. With the leading role of the Studian monastery in Constantinople, Byzantine monasticism played a crucial role in rebuking iconoclasm. Icon-worshipping monks were moved by the non-conformist ethos, which St. Athanasius praised in Anthony the Great and other Egyptian monks. A Studite abbot Theodore became particularly famous for his non-conformism. Theodore wanted to plant in Constantinople both the non-conformist ethos and the Cenobitic traditions of Egypt and Palestine. On their basis, he drafted his own rule. This rule became so popular that most monastic communities in the East eventually adopted it. In particular, the Studite rule framed the newly established monastery of caves in Kiev. From there, it was disseminated through other Slavic monasteries. The Studite monastery played a pivotal role in overcoming iconoclasm. Iconoclasm was a part of the imperial policy aimed at reducing the participation of the church in power sharing and concentrating all power in the hands of the emperors. The Studites, while polemicizing against the iconoclast theology, also defended the share of the church in the Byzantine political system. Eventually, they achieved their goal. They also dramatically increased the prestige of monasticism. Monasticism was redeemed after the havoc of the Chalcedonian period. Late Byzantine Christianity, as a result, became more monastic-centered. For example, the number of bishops from monks dramatically increased. That was the kind of the result of this triumph of monasticism after the crisis of the Chalcedonian period. Eventually, it would become a norm that all Eastern bishops should be monks. Byzantine monasticism after iconoclasm demonstrated its high potential to affect the legitimacy of the emperors. Some of them considered monasteries as a more effective source of political legitimacy than even the official church hierarchy, which to a significant extent had been compromised by collaborating with the iconoclast emperors. So essentially what happened? The state always looked for the sources of legitimacy. The church provided such a source in the beginning, especially the church hierarchs. It was like a resource, but this resource became eventually exhausted. So the vessel of legitimacy, as it were, was drunk up by the emperors to the bottom. It became dry. So the emperors started looking for other sources of legitimacy, and they found this source of legitimacy in monasticism rather than hierarchy. And that is the paradox. The state always needed a source of legitimacy which was not aligned with the state, which was non-conformist. So essentially, non-conformism was like a liquid needed for the state to maintain its legitimacy. And at the same time, the state consumed this source. After consuming this source, they looked for another source. And after the hierarchs, it was monasticism that became the source of legitimacy for the state. And how it happened, how the state essentially drank up the source of legitimacy in monasticism. The later Byzantine emperors began investing in the monasteries more than their predecessors did and expected them to support and boost their legitimacy. They particularly hoped that such a legitimizing role would be played by a relatively new monastic politia located not far from Constantinople on the Chalkidiki Peninsula. It is commonly known as Mount Athos or Holy Mountain. Hermits and small monastic communities had lived there since at least the 9th century. However, Athonite monasticism boomed when emperors endorsed local communities with vast resources and prestigious statuses. The first monastery to receive a special imperial status was the great Lavra, Mihaly Lavra. It was founded by Emperor Nikiforos Phokas. Other emperors after him continued providing for this and other monasteries which had been established nearby. In return, the Athonite monasticism became royal and loyal to the Byzantine rulers. Even nowadays, these monasteries preserve the most significant treasures and legacies of the Byzantine Empire. Seen from this perspective, however, the Athonite monasticism has departed far from the original monastic non-conformism of the Egyptian desert. Many Athonite monks dream of restoring different empires, Byzantine, Serbian, or Russian. St. Athanasius and St. Anthony would be horrified. So I didn't want to make you disappointed because probably some of you became disappointed hearing me praising, the glorious past of monasticism in Byzantium. No, in the end, I became the usual critic of things. So I believe, essentially that the Athonite monasticism, as it emerged on Mount Athos, was envisaged, at least by those who funded it, as the opposite to the original monasticism. It was like the reversal of this non-conformist spirit of the early monasticism. It was the opposite. It was like a substitute for monasticism, essentially. It's a miracle that it continued many of those traditions, of the past. But the original design was exactly to make it the opposite to what it used to be, in the time of Antony and Syriac and Egyptian monks. And we see how, to some extent, it worked and still works, because monasticism is now, the Athonite, if you go to Mount Athos, if you can, then you will see how many pieces, shards of the empires of the past are there, ossified, venerated as relics. They venerate not just the relics of the saints, they also venerate the relics of the empires, very much. There. Even further from the original monastic ideals did the Russian monasticism depart. Its crisis culminated in the controversy between the already mentioned controversy by Lucy, between the so-called possessors and non-possessors, Stяжатели and Nestяжатели. The controversy lasted about a century, from the 1480s through the 1880s, approximately, and epicentered into monasteries, Volodsky and Belozersky. The possessors, led by Joseph of Polotsk, argued that monasteries to fulfill their mission better can and should have possessions, lands, villages, and slaves. The opponents, as it was mentioned by Lucy, led by Neil of Sora, strongly disagreed. This controversy was effectively, I believe, about whether monasticism should be conformist or non-conformist. So I put it again in these terms of conformism. The conformist faction of Joseph won and thus shaped the Russian monastic tradition for centuries. So it was not just about possessions, essentially. It was not just about church lands. It's about the attitude to the state, that it should be conforming. And this tradition, which won, reached its highest point in supporting Putin's wars, I believe. And if you look at the situation nowadays, look at Optina, which is a sort of amalgamation of the spiritual revival after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when so many hopes were that Optina would be really like the engine of the spiritual renewal in Russia. Now we read news about how the monks from Optina would go to the front line and help, the Russian soldiers, killing people there. That is now their main business. To support this war. And take the recently departed starets Ili Nozdrin. This is kind of a Christomatic example of a person who demonstrated his complete conformism. Well, some people try to justify him that he was out of his mind. He had dementia and, but I don't observe him in any point of his life when he was really very much different from this conformist line. And I don't want to blame poor starets. He's now in God's hands, and he has his own judgment. Who are we to judge? But what we need, I think, to understand is throughout its entire history, Eastern monasticism evolved. That was the point of my presentation, the evolution from a very non-conformist standpoint to kind of the pioneer, the protagonist of conformism in modern life. Another note, it's about self-justification. Throughout its entire history, Eastern monasticism featured three main lifestyles. In addition to anachoretism, and communal monasticism mentioned earlier, there was always a third way of monastic life. This vita tertia of monasticism often changed forms and names and was often under the fire of criticism and sanctions by the church. Nevertheless, it has always survived and continues to be practiced today. In Egypt, such monks lived in tiny communities in separate households. They decided for themselves how they wanted to live. Clusters of such small communities were called lavras. In modern Eastern monasticism, this lifestyle became known as idiorhythmia. I remember when I studied in Greece, I was always very much against idiorhythmia for cenobitic life. And I just went in line with all others. There was kind of monastic revival on Mount Athos, and everyone accused idiorhythmia and made jokes about idiorhythmic monks. Now I reconsider it. So indeed, idiorhythmic monks live in communities yet enjoy significant individuals' autonomy. They may have their possessions be paid by the monastery for their services, buy their food, and eat on their own. Until recently, idiorhythmic monasteries constitute a majority of the Athonite communities. After these monasteries converted to cenobia, the idiorhythmic lifestyle was preserved in skeets. The Athonite skeets even now follow a middle path between cenobitic monasteries and anachorites keliots. Monks in the skeets live in small communities under the guidance of an elder. These communities take care of themselves. They participate in the common liturgy on Sundays and feast together with other communities of the skeet. In the Christian East, these were always monks who constantly moved from place to place. They sometimes were called voski, herdsmen, or the ones who eat herbs. Sozomen, the church historian, described this sort of monks in Syria. Let me quote him. When they first entered upon the ascetic mode of life, they were denominated shepherds, because they had no houses, ate neither bread nor meat, and drank no wine, but dwelt constantly on the mountains and passed their time in praising God by prayers and hymns, according to the canons of the church. At the usual hours of meals, they each took a sickle and cut some grass on the mountains, and this served for their repast. Such was their course of life. Wandering monks continue browsing through the cities and villages until our days. Some of them have become famous, such as Cosmas Etolos, or the anonymous Russian pilgrim who lived in the mid-19th century and composed the influential book, The Way of a Pilgrim, candid tales of a wanderer to his spiritual father. Excuse me. Some monks on Mount Athos, after having stayed for some time in one hut, Kaliva, would burn it and move to another one. They do so to avoid attaching to one place and became known as Kapsukalivites, the ones who burned their huts. In the Soviet era, when most monasteries were closed, most monks lived at home or wandered. Some of them educated people in religion, and some disseminated controversial ideas. There were quite a lot of crazy people among them as well. In Eastern Christianity, there were always monks who did not want to live in an organized way. They often loitered in big cities looking for alms and scandalizing local people with their behavior and teaching. The church repeatedly adopted measures to discipline them without much success. At the same time, unorganized monks had more freedom than established ones to follow the original call of the monastic movement, to be non-conformist and countercultural. That is a self-apology, because I feel I belong to the same sort of monks, just as Sister Vassa is, I believe. And this is a sort of apology why we are like that. We are also like Voski. Of course, we don't eat grass. We eat all sorts of things. But I believe it's important for a monk or a nun to be countercultural and non-conformist more than anything else. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much, Father Cyril, for that provocative talk. I find it very invigorating and very much speaking to our topic, this basic underlining of freedom. And for me, when I'm listening to your talk, it becomes clear actually that it's about freedom, the vows of, chastity and poverty also, that they're freeing, and the obedience is also partly to be free of the obedience to authorities that are political or financial. And I also envisioned this conference as a reflection really on the value of freedom. The non-conformism is about, the extent to which we value and are able to embrace freedom. So anyway, what's happening next is we have some time to ask questions of Father Cyril or comment on this very interesting topic. We have about 15 to 20 minutes. Then what we have on the schedule is a light dinner. And for the folks at home, both of you, we after the light dinner, we do have a very interesting panel discussion. All right. So the floor is open to questions, comments for Father Cyril.
I think Scott was first.
So one just absolutely technical footnote, but that's what I do to both you and Lucy, which is that the most recent scholarship on Joseph Volokolamsky and Nostorsky is actually they were not opponents. They viewed each other's work as complementary and valued one another. And that it was only in sort of the subsequent generation that the controversy really happened. And a lot of that had to do because of the state's interference, right?
But we belong to this posterior generation, don't we?
Yeah, definitely. My question is exactly following up on Sister Rosa's comment, which is, thank you for the wonderful talk, by the way. Really gives me a lot to think about, having spent a lot of my early career working on monasticism. I totally understand the idea of it not conforming with the world, but at the same time, especially like Pachomius and so on, this value of obedience. So how do we understand the relationship between obedience and non-conformism?
Yeah, well, excellent point. I believe both non-conformism and obedience are just instruments, effectively. They are not the ends in themselves. They are not the kind of deities of monasticism that every monk is supposed to, to worship. They're just instruments that can help the spiritual perfection. At the same time, as instruments, as any instrumental things, they can harm. They can lead away from the original goal, of those instruments. So that's how we have this guruism and abuses of obedience. Because when obedience is perceived as end in itself, then it easily slips to be abusive, to lead actually to a sort of idolatry. The same is, I'm not super enthusiastic about non-conformism. I believe it can lead to abuses as well. It can produce madness. It can make people crazy, and not really, it can lead to sociopathy. People can become sociopaths in the end. I mean, among the monks, it's another side of non-conformism. That's why. That's why we need to apply what has been called discernment, рассуждение, like the spiritual discernment, which is the way to keep us away from the abuses of all those instruments, including non-conformism or obedience. At the same time, it teaches us to use it wisely.
I have a related question, and I will qualify it by assuring everybody that since you're very dear friends, it's quite clear where my heart lies in prefacing that question. But I wanted to I wanted you to address one of the challenges that are often leveled, and it's related to what you and Scott were talking about, that is very often leveled at the monastics who live outside, live and minister and practice and function outside of some form of monastic communities.
Yeah.
Now, where I find this interesting in the context of Orthodoxy is that, we're always far behind the Western world, in the Catholic Church, for example, or in the Anglican Church, the notion of monastics in the world and their ministries is very normal.
Yeah.
Right? In the Orthodox Church, it's still quite controversial. Even, Mother Maria Skoptsova, who's canonized by Constantinople, is a huge anomaly, and as you know, is a controversial figure for some. And one of the things that's happening around this is that there is an enormous proliferation of, especially with the internet, of the solo independent teachers. And of course, present company included, this criticism is always thrown at everybody sort of wholesale, right? That you're not part of a structure, you're not part of a system of
So therefore, who are you to teach us?
You're not part of the system of some kind of a structure of accountability, and who are you to teach? And I think the reason I brought up the Western precedent is how do you see this can be normalized within the Orthodox context?
Well, I believe there is a parallel. I believe that this sort of monasticism of monks living and nuns living outside the communities, it's pretty much like homosexualism, which is widely spread but not acknowledged and blamed.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, should be. I mean, I'm speaking not about homosexualism now. I'm speaking about the monks and nuns. Well, should we really normalize it? Don't care. I mean, is it so important? Is it kind of existentially important? I don't think so. After all, it's helpful for your own humility. I mean, my own humility, to feel like not quite normal. It's all right. It helps me spiritually. So why should I fight it?
I think Athanasius of Mount Athos required 10 years within the Cenobitic community at the Great Lavada before allowing any monk to
to a hermit as hermits. That is a sort of regulation. They always try to impose those regulations, and they never worked. It's starting with the Council of Trullo, and even before that, Chalcedon. They all try to put like monastic movement into an order. It never worked.
I don't think it's a matter of trying to regulate it in a specific sense, but rather the idea of making sure that the monk was well grounded spiritually before he went off.
That's true. But again,
he did not have the guidance and the community around.
Well, this is the normal, but again, the reality on Mount Athos is that a lot of monks would go straight to hermitages without this stage of of preparation in Cenobia. And again, until the 80s, basically, there were practically no cenobias on Mount Athos. There were only in the Idiorythmic monasteries. Monks did not have where to go, like if they wanted cenobia. It was only the only option which was available is to go either to those crazy keliots, or to go to the skids to live, or to go to the Idiorythmic monasteries, which provided really like, okay, work for us, we give you food, and that's it. That's the only thing we need from you. So this is a very new thing that they require like 10 years in Cenobia. And again,
no, it's nations. This is not hundreds.
Well, yes. I believe that even at that time it didn't work as it doesn't work nowadays. It was like a wishful thinking, something they wanted monks to do. Well, I think that given this insistence of the church to impose those rules, repeatedly, it means that it always failed.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the church, that wasn't coming from bishops or anything, that was coming from the leader of a monastic community
Yeah.
who wanted to ensure that somebody didn't just come into the community and immediately
Yeah.
leave it without, being mature enough.
Well, again, as a sort of intended rule, it was imposed, but rules didn't work and don't work even nowadays. That's what I believe. That's what I conclude from my studies.
You know what this is making me think about in the context of non-conformity and conformity is that if there is a healthy model of church, it should be flexible enough to allow for various forms of personal spiritual formation. I hate the word spiritual, I'm sorry, that's why I hesitated. Just personal formation. Yeah. And so thank you for highlighting all these various things, but the same applies, the same criteria should apply to the laity and and clergy. Different people have different tempers that are suited, that are suited to different lives, really.
Yeah. Even, I agree. The only thing I doubt about is that there could be a healthy model of the church.
No,
I studied the church. Well, that's my kind of main field, and I realized eventually there is no such a thing as
people screw up
a model.
everything,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's a given.
Yeah. Especially the Orthodox Christians. Yes, please.
Say the French scholar and writer on monastic life. I believe it's in his introduction to his French translation of the Ladder of Divine Descent. Presents the theory that his particular point of view, I suppose, that monasticism in the Christian church took the place, played the role of prophets in the Old Testament church. That the intention was that they be the truth shall set you free.
Right.
That this was supposed to be the free voice of the church.
Absolutely.
And the non-conformist element, the non-conformist movement.
Exactly. The only thing, again, as any institution can be abused, therefore prophets turn into false prophets sometimes. But again, it doesn't mean the existence of the false prophets doesn't mean that everyone is a false prophet. Sometimes that we tend to, to generalize.
I want to know something that's bothered me ever since I started reading Dostoevsky and Brothers Karamazov.
Well, I hate him as much as I hate Dionysius.
But the character of Zosima, I mean, this doesn't just apply to Russia. Maybe it applies to many other countries where people talk to monks and to nuns about problems that they have. And I think, about raising children or things that the monk and the nun have never encountered in their own lives. And
which doesn't mean that they don't think about that.
No, of course not.
They do, and they know therefore a lot of things. They believe they don't.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, no, it's just, I sometimes wonder, how do you kind of, if you haven't experienced things personally, like, a difficult marriage, a sexual relationship, and people come to you, and they're very desperate for some kind of answers. How do you kind of research this?
Yeah, good question.
How do you find out about
just
all
guesswork,
these
I believe. People really spoil priests because, we blame priests and gurus. We say, they play this role of guru, but how they started, how they began to become gurus in the first place. I think it started with the people actually demanding them to play a role of guru. They spoil the priest, and then the priests kind of come to like it, and they continue carry on, playing this role. That's why, maybe the best. It's like with what we call pomysly, logismi. First they approach you, and at the early stage you need to say no to them. right? You need to not to consent with them. This applies not just to Pomysly, I believe this logism, but also applies to those people who come to you with the questions that you can't answer. Just say no. I don't know.
The voice of experience here. Most people just want to be heard.
Right.
They don't necessarily want an answer. 90% of the people just want to be heard.
Empathy.
And it's true that monastics often have the time and the opportunity to do that.
To be very patient.
Secondly, I remember when I came to the monastery as a young nun, the abbot said to me, "You're going to hear things and experience things that you would have never even thought of in the world." How can this be? And it's true, because so many different people with so many different problems do approach you. You do end up hearing these absolutely incredible stories that, granted, it's not personal experience, but you do have a much wider range of these stories of resources, let's say, that sort of a person can draw on. That's just
I agree, and this point I agree with late Archbishop Всеволод Majdansky. He used to repeat. He worked before he became like a clergy person. He was a psychotherapist. He said that I'm psychotherapist, and he said that the most important, and actually he served the kind of dysfunctional Jewish families as a specialist. So he had a lot of experience, how to deal. And his main advice was, don't talk, listen to people. That's what they need. That's what the best psychotherapists do. They just listen.
Right.
Yeah.
And sometimes people like that you have no idea about what they're talking about, because that's like, you're totally
it seems like a completely objective sort of.
That frees them up to speak more candidly.
because you're free of their entanglements.
Yeah.
Actually, it's a completely non-monastic but first-hand experience. Being a webmaster for the parish for many, many years, I cannot tell you what kinds of things people write to the Ask the Priest section. And I would agree with Sergey Furmanov that 90% of these pouring out of all kinds of stories and dysfunction and craziness and tragedy is that they're actually not asking any questions.
They make statements, or just.
They just need somebody to acknowledge that they exist with all their.
Like I'm doing to you right now.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, I agree. Yes, I'm listening. Yes, please.
Just one comment about this discussion, and thank you for the question. But one time we went and spoke to a monastic about asking about marriage questions, and he said, "Well, I'm not married." He said, "But I can recommend a good priest that is." So, sometimes they might do that, and I was actually kind of impressed by that, though. It was Father Braga, who everybody knows in the Romanian monastery, and I'm sure that he could have said many wise things to us, but I thought that was a wise thing that he said also, and he did send us to a wonderful priest. But my question for you is, at the very end of your presentation, you said, this explains who Sister Vasa and I are, or you are.
Yeah.
And I didn't catch what that was.
To be like via tertia, the third way.
Oh, the third way.
Right, yes. Meaning that we are free to invent ourselves what we want to.
And what is that called?
Let's coin it. Can we do it?
How baptized
Right.
us.
So I can just say, well, you guys are just like the third way, and everybody knows what that is.
Yes. Well, you can use.
They will.
You could use the original term for that, was key, which means those who graze, on the pasture.
Thanks a lot.
The Alps and the big cities.
Oh, big crazy.
Right.
So what was that word you said? The what?
Was key.
How do
Yeah.
you spell that?
It's in Greek. I mean the modern Greek. It's VOSKOOY.
Just like it sounds.
VASSA. Thank you. So we have, after this wonderful talk, and we can continue to discuss it. Thank you to Father Cyril. So we're having a light dinner, I believe, and don't go away because we have all the invigorating speakers are going to form a panel and we're gonna have questions and answers, and the moderator, Valerie Karas, none other than Valerie Karas, is going to be our moderator. And that's gonna be in exactly 35 minutes. All right, so let's be back in 35 minutes, and we have something that smells very good.
Food and then be back.
Thank you. You know what, Valerie? We can't see you in the video.
Yeah.
Valerie, our moderator, is invisible.
Right.
Right, I thought she understand, but.
Well, hour and a half is a long time to stand.
Yeah.
No, Valerie, why
let's
don't you
turn another
sit
chair.
really? It's gonna be a long thing. Could we move the computer a little bit further? Yes. And tip the lid.
Which side?
Yeah.
Okay, does this include everybody now?
Yeah.
Can I sit down?
Oh no, we need to move in a bit more.
Yeah, good enough.
Should we move a little bit back?
No, I think it's fine.
All right. Are we recording? Yes.
Yes, it's recording in progress.
So we're beginning our panel, everybody, and the folks at home, and I'm handing it over to Valerie Karas, Dr. Valerie Karas, Professor Dr. Valerie Karas, the very Reverend Dr. Professor Valerie Karas. I'm handing it over to the well-known Greek Orthodox theologian, Valerie Karas.
Thank you, sister. So my basic plan here is I'm going to give you all a few minutes to think about what other questions you might have for any of our panelists today. And I'm also going to give you all a few minutes to think about what questions you might have for each other. So to give you that time, I'm going to tell a couple of my own personal experiences. I was really struck with Lucy's discussion of Cyril because I believe Cyril was already the head of the church's Department of External Affairs, wasn't he, in 1988?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was the head. Okay, so I was
He
doing,
was still the Metropolitan of Smolensk, but he got this other job in Moscow. at the time.
okay. I thought it was him. I was pretty sure it was him. You see, so I lived in Thessaloniki from 86 to 90 in Greece, doing one of my doctorates there, and was invited to participate in this week-long conference for the millennium of Christianity of the Rus in Chambézy in the Ecumenical Patriarchate's institute or center outside of Geneva. And there was a relatively large delegation from the Soviet Union there, as well as from several other Eastern European countries. This is still the days of communism, right? And Kirill headed that up, the Russian delegation, the Soviet delegation, which included a couple of interesting people. A bishop who apparently didn't know his Sirah, didn't know what to do behind the altar.
Yeah.
I found out from a friend of mine who was serving back there. And a deacon who was supposed to be Kirill's official translator, who on Sunday, Kirill decided on apparently the spur of the moment that he was going to give a sermon. So, I mean, I'm not completely fluent in French, but I'm okay. And I turned to the person next to me and said, I think I could do a better job and I don't speak Russian. That's how bad a translator he was. So, you know, the KGB people, you know, were already there in that group. And it did, you know, kind of make me wonder. We always wondered. I had served years earlier when I was a student at our seminary at Holy Cross. We had gone to a meeting at St. Vladimir's to put together a first pan-Orthodox theological school consultation. And one of the Vlad students, when we were talking about what translators, what languages we would need, and the Vlad student said, well, you know, the Russians will bring their own, they double as KGB agents. And I laughed because I thought it was a joke, and he just turned to me and he said, I'm not joking. That was the reality, and I fear that we are moving back to those days. Again, the other thing I wanted to mention was, some of you, I know most of you are out of the Russian tradition, you're ROCOR, maybe OCA. I don't know how much you may have heard about Archbishop Spiridon, who succeeded Archbishop Iakovos. But I became embroiled in the middle of the whole thing to get rid of him, basically, because when he came in as Archbishop, I didn't intend to when he came in, but I was a professor at the seminary, and actually my last year there, I had moved into an administrative role. And when he summarily fired the school's president, Father Kalibas, and the librarian, Father Papadimitriou, and two of our professors, one of whom had been the dean of the college for a number of years, was our ethics professor, Father Klopsis, and then Father Ted Stylianopoulos, our fully tenured full professor of New Testament. I went into action, and a few other people worked with me and helped, and we eventually created, thank God for a few people on the Archdiocesan Council and in other top posts who recognized the seriousness of the situation and created a whole organization. And that included something that I think you will be dealing with tomorrow. We were looking at how we could support priests, because one of the first things that happened was that a very prominent priest out in Oakland, California, spoke out against the firings, questioned the firings, and was immediately called to the Archdiocese. And it was only thanks to the intervention of, at that time, Archdeacon Gerasimos Michaleas, who's now the Metropolitan of San Francisco, and a couple of other people that talked him down. He was planning to suspend and even defrock him immediately, and he calmed down a little. But I would get calls at all hours of the day, and people were calling me at home. My family saw what my life had become. People were afraid to call at the seminary because they were afraid the phones were bugged. And priests were afraid to speak out because he had, just put the kibosh on any kind of dissent. And this is the sort of thing that we deal with. And this is where people like me, I'm not ordained, I'm not married to a clergyman, I'm not a monastic, none of them has any power over me. And that's where the laity really needs to come to the fore. And that's where that several of you have mentioned, that prophetic voice of the monastic community. Historically, that's been one of the strengths of monasticism, was to be that prophetic voice. In other words, to say, this is where we're going off the rails. And anyway, those are just a few of my comments. But I wanted to give you guys a chance to talk amongst yourselves. Anybody that knows, us older people that remember the Linda Richmond things on Saturday Night Live. But anyway, give you guys to ask whatever questions you might have for each other before we open it up to the rest of the group.
I have a question probably for Father Kirill, because as a political theologian and a historian, but actually anyone who wants to
If
answer.
everybody could speak up in case people.
And
can't hear.
everybody who wants to answer the question. I would like to bring up a challenge that has been getting a lot of oxygen lately in various circles, and also in my own editorial board at the Wheel, and that is the challenge that orthodoxy is ontologically incapable to function in a democracy, and that orthodoxy, as the Orthodox Church, as it has formed throughout its history, is
the idea, you know, the Paris school shmema, whatever idea that I'll talk about tomorrow, that there can be orthodoxy that's free from the marriage with the government and the service to the state is utterly not just utopian, it's ahistorical, anti-historical. If you could speak to that.
Well, I think it's just another myth about orthodoxy. I think orthodoxy can function anywhere, but usually when it functions anywhere, it doesn't acknowledge that. I mean, there is a difference between the real things as they happen and how it has been phrased or framed or acknowledged. So, for example, orthodoxy changes all the time, permanent. I mean, we would not recognize orthodoxy as it was like, I don't know, 50 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. Now it's a different orthodoxy. It has changed. So it's quite fluid, but we don't notice it because it's not a part of our tradition, noticing changes. And it's not a part of our tradition to acknowledge something that didn't exist like 1,000 years ago. Because we have a myth about orthodoxy, how it exists like in Byzantium. Well, Byzantium is a complete myth, of course. It never existed. It existed as the Eastern Roman Empire, as we know. And orthodoxy existed there. I recently published a piece where I argued that, the title of this is The Church as Res Publica. So essentially, the church functioned as a very important force that shared power with the state. And functioned along many republican sort of ideals. And it constituted the kind of republican residue within the Eastern Roman Empire to a great extent. And our present perception of the church in the Byzantine Empire as this symphonic, even the idea of symphony, it's mythical. It never existed, symphony, right? It always was wished, but never existed, which means that the reality was complex then, and it continues to be complex nowadays. Therefore, it's not given that orthodoxy cannot function, in the democratic environment. Moreover, our intrinsic conformism of orthodoxy helps us to accommodate ourselves to the new circumstance. Take the Church of Greece. It was one of the most monarchical churches. Like they anathematized Venizelos, for example. I mean, they did things unthinkable nowadays. And nowadays, it's the most democratic church, in the Orthodox world. It is, well, believe me. It happened because of this conformism, as a matter of fact. So we of course, we criticize conformism today, but let us also acknowledge the good things about conformism. Essentially, it helped some churches that found themselves were thrown to a democratic environment, like in Greece, to eventually accommodate themselves and to become more democratic. So it's, of course, this democratization of the church does not come from within the church. It is imposed, and the church just accepts it. But still, the result is the same.
So what about the challenge that we can't even get a council together without the emperor?
Yeah, good.
That's a pretty classic one, right?
And again,
But exactly, tried and failed because we don't have I mean, I'm not arguing this point of view. I'm throwing the challenge into the room.
Well, in Russia, you couldn't have the council until you got rid of the emperor.
No, that's right. Well, that's.
Well, maybe there's a myth also about conciliarity.
well, certainly it's a myth about our synodality. It doesn't exist. It's not our identity. Well, it's our identity, but not our reality. That's for sure.
But there's also a myth, I think, that I wish would be articulated a little bit more in this year of Nicaea, that the actual reception of the councils and the actual influence of the councils is a little bit of a myth, right? Like how much of the council's decisions were actually received ever and influential. How much of actual liturgical practice was much more influential than the actual proclamation of councils. I mean, we profess the so-called Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, not the way the fathers professed it, but actually in the first person singular,
Yes, right.
which is the baptismal formula and not the conciliar formula.
Right.
And it wasn't until like liturgical reception that the council mattered. So things like that, or maybe when we think that our conciliarity is not happening just because the bishops weren't able to get together, maybe we're getting together in other ways, and maybe our episcopal centricity is one of these idols that needs to be recognized to be not what we think it is. You know, we think the church isn't speaking. Why isn't the church saying anything? Say it, whether it's the war in Ukraine, where's the bravery? Well, what if the church is in the cell of Alexei Navalny and is shedding blood there, you know, where the church doesn't even want to bury him? You know, there was a problem in Moscow. It was this horrible travesty of not, but I'm not even mentioning the martyrs that the blood's being spilled in Ukraine so there's a lot of this, and meanwhile, civic society and a lot more democratic sort of forms of conciliarity, I think, are happening in a society like Ukraine.
And in that more organic idea and understanding of conciliarity, it can take quite a while for things to work themselves out. As we see, for instance, with the iconoclastic period, where you have two phases of iconoclasm, you have competing councils back and forth that are all claiming to be ecumenical. And it takes 100 or 200 years for the church to kind of decide which one is it going to accept that way. I wanted to go back for a minute to your original question, because I actually gave a paper on this topic back during when we were dealing with Spiridon, and in the aftermath of that, I gave a paper at the American Academy of Religion on this question. I think that we have a particular problem here in the United States because we are built on church-state separation. So we have a polity, an understanding of how the church works that did develop in the East Roman or Byzantine period that was based on that notion of symphonia, regardless of how well that worked out in reality or not. That was certainly the ideal that they worked under. And so the emperor took a very important role and really, in a sense, represented the laity, represented the people as a whole, and acted as a counterweight against episcopal power and authority. And that's gone in the US. We cannot have that here. And that has created its own problems because we don't have another thing set up. So I will bring as an example, a perfect example of the problem with this, the Serbian church case here in the US. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but the Serbian church several decades ago split down the middle, well, not down the middle, because most of them went with the archbishop who had been deposed for no good reason, it appears, by the Patriarchal Synod in Belgrade. And all the lower court decisions, district and appellate decisions, sided with him and the majority of the parishes here in this country, because the Patriarchal Synod in Belgrade had clearly violated the charter that the church here, the archdiocese here had. They split the archdiocese into, God, this sounds so familiar because it's exactly what Bartholomew then did with Archbishop Iakovos and the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of North and South America. And yet at the Supreme Court level, they reversed the lower court decisions. And the rationale they gave was that the Serbian church had acknowledged being a hierarchical church, and for some reason, the American court system seems unable to understand any notion of hierarchy that isn't like the Roman Catholic model. And so their decision was, well, yes, they violated apparently your canons, they violated the charter that was signed. Yes, we recognize all of that, but you have acknowledged being a hierarchical church. So whatever the head of your church says goes. So yes, we do have issues that we have to deal with because we have to find a way to give some authority to the laity in our churches in this country because we don't have any other counterweight. The government is not going to provide that for us.
So the model of the Moscow, the Moscow Council of 1917-18 model, right? Again, I don't want to rehash the paper that I'm going to give tomorrow, but that was the model that attempted to rethink, the structure of the church, the stewardship, the governance of in the church, give a greater role to the laity, rebalance create this liturgical reform, which they never got to because it got too bloody in the streets. And I think it's interesting, I don't know if you would agree with me, Valerie, that this model got no traction in the democratic countries outside of the Russian diaspora that followed the model, right? So they actually took it with them. I find it fascinating, and I'm not defending any point of view. I just brought up something that's very much
Well,
discussed.
we did have a similar model in the Greek Archdiocese as it was originally created. The first charter set this up as an autonomous church with diocesan clergy laity assemblies voting on electing their bishops.
Right.
And the archbishop being, I can't remember now if it was a three-person ballot then was sent to the patriarch.
Yeah, it was the same model, right?
Yeah.
But
And then that was taken away.
And then it was taken away, right? But it also, I think what's more interesting is that it sizzled out in many ways in the communities that carried it forth. And so that's kind of a question.
No, I'm not on the panel, but
No, you can ask a question.
It was adopted by the council, but it was never implemented. They carried away papers. They didn't carry away a practice.
That's not true. The exarchate still functions the same way, and the OCA was set up that way. It actually was, there are working models, and these working models, and again, I'm not even playing devil's advocate. I'm just kind of talking to you, and I think it relates to the question of conforming to the authority and to your Dionysian model, right? Of course. Like, can we actually get ourselves? Can we think of ourselves outside the Dionysian model, or do we eventually just start, faltering and falling apart? And I think it's a big challenge, especially now, because okay, we have Tsar Putin in Russia, right? But who's ruling the church? But in some ways, it's an aberration. He's really not a Tsar. It's not a true empire. We're not going to have Tsar Trump, and we're not going to
create it.
Yeah, but it's not. These things are not. These structures are just not coming back. So, to Father Cyril's point, is our structure and how we deal with that, and how our incestuous desire to always get into bed with the state, this yearning for getting into bed with the state, is this part of us, or is it because we can't think any better, any other way? Yes, any other way.
I think that this was one of the arguments of, I'm going to talk about it tomorrow in my talk, but if you look at the support that the conformism of the declaration of Metropolitan Sergius was proclaiming, those who were supporting Sergius often wrote that it was always this way.
Yes.
This argument of this kind of defeatism that to say that that's our norm, I think that that's when you really are in trouble, when you say you fall back on like the worst examples, or you canonize, you say that the norm is this. And I think that you always have to keep the canon, even if you're falling short of it. You don't proclaim as canonical that which is
Practice.
yeah, that which is a failure to actually follow your vocation, which is to martyrdom.
If I can jump in, thinking of both the sort of conciliar or synodality, whichever word you want to use, sobornost in Russian, and democracy question. So tomorrow I'll be talking about Saint Tikhon, Patriarch of Moscow, that hopefully many of you are familiar with, but becomes Patriarch in 1917, right during the middle of the revolution. So in the first part of 1917, he was still the Archbishop of Vilnius in Lithuania. And in May, so when he became, actually, when he first, so before that, he was the Bishop of North America. When he arrived in 1898, he was the sole bishop of the entirety of North America, right? From Alaska to New York, right? And beyond. And in his very first sermon on assuming the cathedra in San Francisco, because at those days the diocesan center was in San Francisco, he invited the people of his diocese to become his co-workers, to cooperate, in Russian, sodействие, to cooperate with him. And he specified not just the clergy, but also the laity, and appeals to St. Paul's model of the church as a body, that every member has a crucial role to play in building up the church. And then when he returned to Russia in 1907, he went to Yaroslavl, basically said the same thing again to his Yaroslavl flock. And then in 1914, when he went to Vilnius, he said the same thing again to his Vilnius flock. And then in the May 1917, after the monarchy has fallen, he meets together, there's like a diocesan congress with the clergy and the laity, and he reminded them how in his first sermon he had called them to this action. And he says that now that the monarchy has fallen, there was even broader possibilities for such participation than ever before. And I quote from that speech, which was only recently discovered and published, quote, "With the change of government that has now taken place, you are called upon not only to organize the local parish life," right, which before was the idea that the laity would contribute to building up their own parish, and maybe also at the diocesan level. But he says now even concerning the national questions of the transformation of both the church and the state, because by this point they're already planning for the Great Church Council that took place in 1917. So he was calling, this is your chance now, all of you, clergy and laity, to contribute to the transformation of the church through the council. But they're also starting to plan for a constituent assembly, this kind of, that would be a freely elected body that would determine the future shape of the government in a diplomatic way, in a democratic way. So he even goes so far as to say explicitly that upon his audience, clergy and laity together, lay the responsibility for organizing, quote, everything ecclesiastical and even governmental. Radical stuff, right, for a bishop at that time to be saying, and also such an intriguing way in which he explicitly ties together this idea of the sobornost, the building up of the church of clergy and laity, but also then sort of transferring that into an idea of democracy.
Thanks, it's good.
Didn't last.
Yeah, did you want to add anything? Not even necessarily on.
People often question this church and state. This question comes up throughout history, actually, and I always felt it was important in this, in a sense, to look towards the apocalypse, where the church is spoken of as being in the desert and completely separate from any sort of governmental system, or the church exists ultimately outside of all of that. It's in the desert, the union of the faithful. It's something that, yeah, government throughout history has played various roles and been more or less influential in different circumstances. But ultimately, that's part of this world and the way the church functions there. If we're going to look even further, then it's important to remember that, you know, it isn't of this world, that earthly governments can just go so far, that we're called to something greater.
Transcendent as well as imminent. I've given you guys a lot of time to think about questions, anything new.
Just a
Not
little
necessarily
addition.
about this.
Yeah, what Kinga said, that it may seem that we're not able, you know, to live, to build our life as we should. But I think very often, as in this case and in other cases, when people say they can't, it's really that they don't really want to. And I think this is a big question. Because it may look like, you know, we're trying to do something and there are these terrible totalitarian systems that do not permit us. But I think it's way much more complicated than that. So it's, I think I would propose to change the optic in this sense and to think why, we as a broad community are not ready for a change, even when we can. But, you know, I think there are still some optimistic examples. I mean, it may seem very local, but if you look at the Orthodox Church in Finland, for example, it's pretty much functioning.
It's what?
Functioning. I mean, criticize anything else, but it sort of works, and it works in a free way. And then, you know, another question is, especially now and in this country, not how we can live, but as a church, but also why democracy itself, in the way we thought, is functional and, how should I say, it's a bit of a jet lag. You know, but why does it fall apart?
Why is it so fragile?
Why is it
Why
so
is it so
fragile?
fragile? Yeah,
Because we stopped caring. I mean, we're not free. Timothy Snyder says this in his brilliant book on freedom. He's like, the reason we're free is because we care about stuff. You know, if you don't care and you're like, you know what? Trump said this. Okay, well, maybe that's okay. Or what did they do now to Social Security? Or what did Musk do? Right? And people don't really care. They don't want to take responsibility. You know, everybody's like gets passive because I don't know. I think we what liberates us is that we care enough to put ourselves out there, you know, because we care enough. But we're not free when we stop, like, you know, like when we don't really care. And I think faith is what makes us care. Like if we believe, you know, we have values. Don't you think that we're strong when we believe?
But this responsibility is precisely the target and this feeling of solidarity. Just to give an example, yesterday in Paris, I was speaking to just a little illustration to contemporary Russia. I spoke to one deacon, and I mean, he's not a public person at all, but he signed a letter which was a letter of solidarity with the case of Father Alexei Uminsky, who was defrocked. And simply that signature meant that he, for example, he's doing a lot of work on catechism and Sunday schools throughout Russia, that he would fly from, for example, Moscow to Omsk in Siberia for a lecture presentation, and it would be cancelled 1 hour before it began. So I think what you were saying is precisely the target, and it's the greatest fear, you know, this Dionysian model that this we comes from above. It's the same in the church and the state. These people, they think that they have the monopoly to say the word we, and neither in the state nor in the church we're allowed to say that on our behalf. So it's really a question, you know, like in credit, you know, who says we? They want us to say I, you know, to always to show us as some kind of isolated monads.
Yeah, that's why it's what we're doing now. It's conciliar, whatever you wanna. I mean, the fact that we have been able to do something together. It's encouraging, right? And it's because that frees us, the fact that we can dare to come together.
I think that you've really just focused on the raison d'être for this conference, one of the things. I mean, we're definitely a crisis, when this conference was conceived, part of it, it was
a virgin birth.
It was a virgin. No, I wouldn't say it was a very non-traditional family, wasn't it? When it was conceived, we had the case of Russia in mind, right? More than anything in Russia and Ukraine, and now all of a sudden we're in the middle of this train wreck of the world, of the world, because train wreck of Ukraine is a train of America. Is a train. That's true. It's a train wreck of the world. But I think yes, but without this specificity, you're right. But I think it's providential in a way that we're talking about it even in a relatively small circle, because to all of your points, actually mine too, which is why I started this conversation, is we are the church. I mean, we in this room, we represent how many jurisdictions? I mean, we are the church, right? We're not the OCA, ROCOR.
Let's say it together.
Yeah, let's say it together. And so we are the people. All right, you got it.
Children. Yeah, but that's all too often forgotten.
But that's very much forgotten, and this happens to me. I mean, those who ever read my screeds, that I'm given to this, like, well, what are we doing about XYZ? This is like my favorite challenge, and I really do it all not because I expect the bishops to react, because the bishops don't react when I literally smack them in the face with this question. Metropolitan Stephen just smiles. He's a very good smiler, but it's because it's a challenge to us. What do we do? What do we do? And really, this is the question of conformism and non-conformism. What do we do? What do we do when ICE shows up at church? This is a big American question, right? Or at a liquor store and harasses, Hispanic person. What do we do? Something happens every day that affects not necessarily us, but our neighbors, sometimes us.
Yeah.
And if we are Christians and are serious about it, yes, we're very comfortable in our bourgeois American existence.
I think we became comfortable also in the church as some kind of consumers, and like where we come as spectators to the performance of bishops and priests, and that passivity has cost us like the kind of faith and action. When you don't have that security blanket, that they somehow are, they're somehow make orthodoxy is them, right?
Yeah.
But if you start to realize that it's not an abstraction, like it's insofar as we are the church body actively putting ourselves on the line to express. I mean, love always has an aspect of sacrifice, right? It's love that elevates Christ on the cross. So our willingness to be uncomfortable, also to experience the discomfort when we don't please a bishop who might be demanding this or that thing, and you don't look like the obedient example that maybe, you know what I mean? Like you're not externally going through the motions. And that
You tell
becomes
us, you
uncomfortable.
show us how to dismiss bishops.
What?
That's a great example.
I serve at their displeasure.
Can I ask
Well,
a
and
question
sometimes
about
that-
Ukraine? Because I was wondering when I went there in September 2022, why there were quite a few parishes where the parishioners themselves had decided, okay, we don't want to be in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church anymore because Kirill is still being commemorated at liturgies. We want to move. Or sometimes it was the priest, but you know, it's a very vexed question at the moment. What makes up the parish? Who are the parishioners? Is it all the people you've got on your list? Or is it the people that regularly come every Sunday? And like quite often, it seems like the secular authorities don't really know what's going on. And there's been some sort of heavy-handed chucking people out of churches and what have you. But I wanted to know why the autocephalous church created by the Thomas from Bartholomew has been so unsupported apart from Cyprus, Greece and Alexandria. Why do you think that other local Orthodox churches in the world haven't come and supported this church and embraced it, given what's happening to Ukraine at the moment? That's what I want to know.
I think this question is to me, right?
Yeah.
Well, there are two questions actually. What is happening inside Ukraine? What is happening from outside Ukraine? So inside Ukraine, the dynamics are very complex. Like, for example, I observed the increase of the enhancement of horizontal relations within the UOC, Moscow Patriarchate, whatever it is, because they're under pressure, because they are kind of under pressure from the other church, or they're under pressure from the society, and it makes them kind of reorient themselves in the sense that to enhance exactly this horizontal dimension. I observe an enhancement of the vertical dimension in the autocephalous church, within the autocephalous church. At the same time, on the level of the communities and the relationship between bishops and the communities, in the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, why you observed correctly that sometimes communities vote to switch, and they're not allowed to do so, because essentially bishops, not all of them, but many bishops impose this idea that I'm the bishop, I'm the church, and your decision doesn't matter. I said, whatever you decide, it doesn't matter. It has been also constituted on the level of the statutes of the church. So it's a very complex dynamics in ways. It's what happens within. As from the outside, I think it's mostly, well, first of all, this is the refusal to acknowledge the new church by most other Orthodox churches has to do with the denial of the war by most of the Orthodox churches. They just don't register it. It doesn't exist. I mean,
but how can that be when
I don't know.
Well,
That's a second. That's about.
It's a question we brought up.
Yeah.
In June of 22,
Yeah.
and nothing happened.
It took the Ecumenical Patriarchate a century to recognize the autocephaly of the Bulgarian Church.
No, but what the fact that the Orthodox, what Father Cyril is talking about, is the fact that the Orthodox oikumena is existing as if this war of one huge ostensibly Orthodox state for the destruction of another Orthodox state is not happening. It's like
Yeah, just
Well, I think
doesn't
part of it
exist.
is that people are recognizing that there's, excuse my language, but a pissing match between Constantinople and Moscow.
Yeah, they like to put it in this way, which is wrong.
It's, well, of course, the actual issues are much larger than that, but they're focusing on that aspect of it and don't want to get
Well,
involved.
and again, we need to ask ourselves, whether it is a reason or an excuse for the churches not to recognize, because sometimes it's just an excuse, you know, not to
Absolutely.
recognize. They quarrel with one another,
Yeah.
we don't want to deal with that, but it's a nice, like the tension. And I believe that is one of the main reasons. The denial to register the war leads to the denial of a church there. Because, well, the OCU is a result of the war. It was recognized by after 2014, when the war started, actually.
Right.
So I believe that the church really received, I mean, the OCU received the possibility to be acknowledged, to be given Thomas because of the war. Without the war, it would have not properly happened. And the second thing is fear. People, well, the churches are driven by fear. We
And let's not
mentioned today.
forget about,
Yeah, well, it's
Remind-
both carrots and stick, of course. There are both carrots and sticks. Carrots meaning US dollars, of course.
Or
Um,
Russian
yeah,
dollars.
oh, yeah.
That's-
yeah, exactly.
They're
I mean,
spending it,
they'll-
and don't forget about Africa
and Africa
and
as
how they're
well.
taking over
Exactly.
parishes in the Patriarchate of
But
Alexandria.
always it's the same US dollar, even for the Russians, you know. And then they don't pay in rubles. And the second thing is fear.
Nobody wants
It's really fear.
yes,
They really
he
afraid
did
of.
not mean it was paid by Americans. I mean, the Americans before the middle of January.
Yeah. So, questions?
I have a question for three people. I'm sorry if I don't address you correctly, but Professor Scott, when you were talking about St. Tikhon and I think the conclusion, you said something about you have to work together with about all of it. And I wonder what is the practical implication of that? What is all of it? Like the democracy of the church or the life of the church, the liturgy, what does he mean by saying that, do you think?
Well, in that context, specifically, of course, the church council they were planning at that stage already was to address all aspects of church life, right? From the highest level of ecclesiastical administration down to parish life, monasticism, the role of women, everything. Education, everything, literally everything. And how it worked was that every parish elected a delegate, and every member of the parish, men and women both, had a right to vote to elect a delegate who would go to then the diocesan assembly. And at the diocesan assembly, they would elect delegates, both lay and clergy, who would then go to the church council. And so a lot of from all levels, the parish to the assembly, and then the assembly to the national church council, they came with things they wanted to talk about, right? And issues and concerns and ideas and everything else. So there was a sense in which the voice literally of every single person potentially carried through all the way to the center of the church council. But what I found especially striking about that comment was that because it was the time when there was this dramatic transformation, both of the church, but also of the government, he was appealing to the people. That is because, Russia, the citizens and the believers were not obviously coterminous, because there was lots of people who belonged to other religions in the Russian Empire, but nevertheless the people he was addressing, that your participation not only can be involved in this sort of dramatic transformation process of the church, but also for the state. It's time for you to give your input and have your responsibility for the future of what the Russian state is going to look like.
So that was radical for then. For now,
Yeah.
it's in theory the way the OCA supposedly works. Only nothing really happens or gets done.
Yeah.
But in theory, it's
Yeah.
That's what
Well, that was really radical. Yeah, for a Russian bishop in 1917. And of course, he had had that long experience of being in North America, so he knew, something about democracy, right? And I often, if you sort of envision alternate histories, if only democracy had succeeded in 1917 instead of the Bolsheviks taking power, and Tikhon had become the patriarch, right? He would have been kind of the ideal person to be at the head of the church while the country was democratized.
Thank you. And my other question is for Sister Vasa and Apis. Sorry, I don't know how to say your name.
She's like,
You said about, she's always making fun of me. You said about the
I do it with affection, Natalie.
the way that we have to, each of us individually be this change in the church or this action in the church, and like Alexei Navalny and be him, and that's how we're gonna change our churches to be what we need to have happen, or more fools for Christ. And I feel like that's exactly where we are. That's what we need everywhere,
Yeah, I think women actually also have a fool for Christ kind of sometimes wisdom to them, when you play stupid and you just play stupid and you say things like you're not really saying anything. I mean, you know how to do that. You're married.
I do it all the time.
You pretend like it's his decision, right?
On the unmarried should not. Conversation.
Yeah, you just.
Well, that's the same with bishops.
Oh, I see.
You start to mother them. Is this still being recorded?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, but you're empowered to edit it, so don't worry.
Well, anyway.
There's things that mothers know.
In all seriousness, I really, that's encouraging to me, because I feel like that's the kind of voices that we need, like yours. And,
And like yours, yeah.
And yeah.
Because it's this, it's very hard for us to rid ourselves of this very, like I said, Episcopocentric, not denying, it's not this reckless, denial either of hierarchy or an iconoclasm. I'm not talking about that, but it's, as Father Andrei said, it's an excuse sometimes just to sit back, not to take any responsibility. And it's hard, I think the hardest part is for parish priests who deal with the large passivity of parishioners. But we have to, act and be church on the weekdays, be church. I started thinking about the hours because of this, and the weekdays, because it's in between the Sundays. I mean, we have this, it's a very mixed blessing of having this Eucharistic ecclesiology that makes everything about the Eucharist. Well, most of our life happens outside of it, so what happens on the weekdays? What are we doing at home? How are we witnessing, every time we have exchanges online? How do we react to a get together like this? And we shouldn't be discouraged if the numbers are small. The people at home can't see the hundreds of people here, but, we don't have to be discouraged in any event, we do the little things. Like Alexei Navalny would say, it's not a shame to do a little. He said it's a shame to not do anything.
And when you reach those crises, those times of crisis, like I've discovered in my own situation with Spirita, all that complexity that Father Cyril was talking about a few minutes ago, ultimately, you have the choice of doing the right thing or not. Sometimes it really does just become black and white, and not doing anything is the wrong thing.
Right.
Because not doing anything is a choice, it is a decision, it is an action to choose inaction, and that has its own consequences. Somebody had their hand raised.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, you've got one more now?
Oh, I just wanted to say, she said something so profound about the church being in the apocalypse,
Mhm.
that we're in the desert.
Mhm.
I don't think we have to wait a long time for that. I feel like we're there.
Well, I think in many ways, we do live in a post-Christian world, post-Christian society. At any rate, we're moving in that direction, and we do have to think about being in the desert. There's this question of responsibility. To a great extent, church has become a spectator sport. If someone performs the service for you, and you can comfortably sit back and enjoy the music, or comment on the sermon, that's your participation in this. We witnessed that at the monastery when we ended up without enough clergy to have a daily liturgy, and suddenly, if there was going to be a service, it was because we were going to do it, and not because someone was going to come and perform it for you. And I thought ultimately it became a really positive thing. The sisters developed a completely different attitude towards the service. If you want the service, you do it. You get together, you pray it. You don't wait for someone to come and perform it. So again, something supposedly negative, this lack of clergy, turned out to be providentially a very positive thing for the community. So you can't lose. You can't lose faith, you can't lose heart, but you do have to take that responsibility to make these decisions, to step out and say, well, just because we've done it that way for 50 years, well, today we're going to do it differently.
Thank you.
Anybody else over here had their hand raised, I thought earlier? Already dealt with it, or?
I just wanted to sharpen a little bit something that you said about making a choice. I think that in the church, like in every situation, in every system, really, the question of agency is actually not. It's not an ontological given, right? And what I mean is that we can play. Many years ago, I had a debate and essays exchange with Father John Gillians about the interpretation of Saint Ignatius of Antioch and his model of the church. And
Very Episcopal.
What?
Very Episcopal.
Well, that was his point, and to which I pushed back and said, well, you got to read the whole of Ignatius and look at the council, at the part where he says the bishop is nothing without the councils of the presbyters. The bishop is made, only exists because of the council of presbyters. So it's that, no, it's not. It's not heavily Episcopal. It's both, and so the way that it relates to this point is that the abrogation of agency belongs to people who decide that the agency belongs with somebody else. Okay, now in our case, it belongs with the bishops, but it's also, to Father Cyril's story, going to the priest and asking him to make a life decision for you. Yes, right? Why? So I don't think that you can blame the abuse of the structural system and the inability to function without a hierarchy or without an emperor as a head on the system itself. Ultimately, it's everybody's agency.
If I may add to this, because Ignatius was mentioned, and I discovered quite accidentally a parallel between what Ignatius told about this relationship with the bishop, this monoepiscopacy, and his forms, with another treatise by Cicero. So it was kind of a wow kind of thing that when I discovered it. So Ignatius speaks about monoepiscopacy, that nothing is to be done without the bishop. At the same time,
Ignatius was the bishop of Antioch at the end of the 1st century. It was.
And usually people who like advocate for episcopacy, they refer to him because Ignatius was promoting this kind of mono-episcopacy. At the same time, he was speaking about the relationship between the bishop and the clergy and the communities as a harmony when you play guitar. Kithara, he used the word. And actually, I found a parallel in Cicero, because Cicero was, when he was speaking about the De Officiis Imperii, he was speaking also about a guitar. He referred to this imagery of playing a guitar. And he made this reference in a very particular context of protecting the republican values against, the position from the empire. Essentially, his point was, look, the state should function as, as playing a guitar. It should be in harmony. And essentially, he was contesting this imperial authority against the republic that was fading away, and Cicero tried to protect it. So Ignatius, probably, that's my guess, read, because this is a unique imagery that Cicero used. And if Ignatius used this imagery, it was essentially in the context of protecting this, republican dimension even within the church. He was saying, look, we are not for the monarchy in the church. We are for the horizontal relations in the church, but with some sort of moderation, coordinating role played by the bishop, by a bishop.
I think
Right.
Well, that was exactly my point, and that's why I'm talking about the fact that, yeah, okay, you can take, it's, I think, canonical, who knows, you take anything and twist it, your way, right?
And you could totally forget about the actual meaning
Yes.
of the original symbols. You lose the symbolic language, you lose the meaning of words, including the word orthodoxy. And I don't want to tell you what I'm going to say tomorrow about it so that you come to my talk. But it's a very important word. And when Father Cyril says that orthodoxy is different in every given snippet of time, we are different in every given whatever, just measure snippet of time. So the fact that we're called constantly to define and redefine, rediscover the meaning of words. That not very clear quote that politicians sometimes quote, but nobody knows who said it first. I looked into it. When words lose their meaning, people lose their freedom. Nobody knows who said it first. You said. I think it was me. You can say, instead of writing like Confucius, but it's true, if we become we end up serving some kind of, because like the word orthodoxy, which is not in the creed, but we've come to define ourselves by it, right? We are sort of embarrassed of the fact that the word Catholic is in the creed. So we either translate it away until it's unrecognizable, like with some work, or we just, yeah. So I think that we're called again to rediscover what the word means, and it is it's a complex word because both halves of that word have a variety of meanings, and we're not tied to understanding it exactly the way it was understood, because I'm in Rome right now for months writing a book about the meaning of this word and the history of it. We have the freedom also to define it for what it means to us, because the breadth of the word allows for a lot of interpretation, just like we receive in tradition texts of scripture, we receive liturgical prayers that we understand in our context. So what does this word mean? And what is the meaning of, when you look into it and the meanings of something like ortho or orthi, stand aright, the straightening out, you have a verb like orthoo, which means to straighten out, to correct. It means all sorts of interesting meanings. And then with the last part of the word, that it could mean, it could be, and it has been understood to mean different things from, like the locale of a kind of expectation or of the kind of presumption and opinion. It can mean, yes, like glory and glorification, all of these things. When you put together those words, you can have, like the understanding that's very much tied to the kind of, process that we subject ourselves to, not something we possess as an identity, like here, I got baptized in the right church, or I commemorate the right bishop, I'm automatically what is called Orthodox, right? If we rediscover this word as a call, not as a given, it's something that we're also taught in Father Kirill's book to distinguish between things that are a given or things that are a call, right? Like a challenge. So are we challenged to be straightened out, like consistently, like a lifelong process, to be the orthi, to be those crooked things, that the things that become not clear to us, our vision is crooked, we're crippled in fear, like the woman in the synagogue that Christ, straightened out physically. Like how can we breathe life again into our words that are important, right? Like orthodoxy. How can we be freed, like that woman was freed from this crippling being bound? And Christ says several things about freedom in that whole miracle of the healing of this woman. Then I think, and it says that she is anorthotite or something, some complicated Greek word like that contains this ortho in it. How can we maybe breathe life into this word so that we see that actually our process of being liberated from the crookedness, including our people pleasing, our false understandings of obedience, the things that make us silent when we should be speaking, the things that make us indifferent, complacent, that make us consumers in the church, all of this stuff, right? That we want our vision to be, we want to start working on, anyway, I'll finish this little tirade of mine, but it felt good to get it off my breast. Yeah,
But
sorry.
I think you raised an important point, and something you said a little bit earlier also fits into, so it's the paucity of language, and somewhat related to that is the reification of symbolism, which I think is another important problem that we have in the church. We're very big on symbols, and symbols are very important, but we can't we have problems as soon as we start making the symbols into concrete reality and thereby exclude everything that doesn't fit that symbol. And I think this is part of the problem, going back to what Father Kirill said about Pseudo-Dionysius's celestial hierarchy. I love Maximus the Confessor, one of my faves. And one of the things that I love about Maximus, he uses Pseudo-Dionysius and then he twists him. Because he takes that celestial hierarchy, that whole idea, what that hierarchy is about, that Pseudo-Dionysius talked about, is that everything is being mediated through higher levels. So you don't have any direct contact at the highest level. You have to go through these intermediate levels, and they go through their intermediate levels above, et cetera. And what Max did was he flattened the hierarchy. He just completely flattened it. So he uses the idea of mediation, but then he says, all of us, human beings, we are a microcosm of creation, and therefore we are all called, we all have the same vocation, which is to mediate all of creation. And ultimately, of course, Christ is the ultimate mediator, because the final level of separation, of difference, is between the creator and creation, and only the creator in its own self can ultimately transmute that final difference. But it goes back to this idea that we are all called to do something. It's not just a role for the clergy or a role for the hierarchy. Every single one of us is called to that same mediatorial role.
Yeah.
I love Max.
No one blames you.
He is difficult. He is difficult.
To put in a little plug for the wheel for those who don't know about it or haven't read it yet, which is not anybody understandable. There's a very good paper on that in the issue that's coming up any day now by Mark Chinowek. The issue is on identity. It's called Who Am I? And he's got a paper that he presented last year at OTSA, the Orthodox Theological Society of America annual meeting, on exactly that. I think that you might be able to.
I was involved for a number of years in this international Buddhist Christian theological dialogue, and I did a paper on Max and this whole notion, the Buddhists loved it. Most of the Christians didn't understand the whole concept. The Buddhists, and it's like you have to realize that Buddhists don't believe there's a God and don't believe in an existent soul that's like, self-perpetuating. We're combinations of different things that change over time. But that whole understanding of how we're related to the rest of creation and that we're eternally changing and all of that. One of them wanted to make me an honorary Buddhist, So you never know how these things are gonna, how they're going to sit with others.
Resonate, yeah.
Yes, resonate with others. There have to be more questions out there. Things that you guys are, or comments.
People are running out of steam.
Well, I have something for Father Cyril, but also everybody else too, because you were talking about monasticism as a countercultural movement in early Christianity, which it very definitely was, and there's tons of books about this, and particularly about, I love how it was kind of double countercultural for women, because it meant that they were not only going against societal expectations, but their families' expectations. And we have saints' lives that are filled with stories of women who are, young women who are disobeying their families, that want them to make these, great marriages in terms of societal expectations, etc. What about the transvestite saints?
Yeah.
How far is that in terms of countercultural? So there is a whole category of saints.
Yeah.
Do you mean transvestite or transgender?
No, transvestite. So there's a whole, so there's a whole category of, these are
I
women
wasn't being
saying,
provocative.
no, these are a whole category of, there are a number of them.
Women saints who dress.
Yes.
Yeah.
And now, for those of you who think, how could they get away with that? Remember that there were eunuchs in the ancient world.
Right.
So to have a young man who was beardless and remained beardless as he got older, they could believe that because there were eunuchs, My favorite story is Pelagia and Nonus. So Pelagia was this very wealthy and well-known courtesan. And this bishop, Nonus, sees her as she's going by, and he's surrounded by his clergy. And they're all bitching about her. Oh my God, this fallen woman, blah, blah, blah. And Nonus, God, I love him. He goes,
It's a beautiful image.
It is, isn't it? Because he goes, look at her. Okay, so this is her life. And she puts all of her effort into it. She buys the most beautiful clothing and the makeup and all this stuff. And And I feel so terrible in comparison to her. I don't put nearly half of my effort into, I'm supposed to have devoted my life to God and all the rest of it. And of course the others are looking at him like he's nuts. But, I mean, and then she hears about him. And so she starts going to meet with him secretly and she's getting catechesis. And eventually she decides that she wants not only to become a Christian, but she's going to become a monk. She's going to get rid of everything of her current life. And they switch clothes so she can escape. And she goes out to a monastery, into a men's monastery, and lives for the rest of her life. Nobody even recognizes who she is. And there's other of these transvestite saints. But I mean, this level of countercultural.
Well, I believe that the it indeed existed. This transvestite tradition. I think there were more cases than have been registered.
Yeah, I'm sure.
For sure. And certainly it was a phenomenon. We could say that it was not just one or two cases. It was a phenomenon. I believe it's a speculative thing. What I believe, but I still believe it, is that this transvestitism emerged as in the period when if someone wanted to be equal to man and therefore could go to a monastery and to be herself in a monastery and to be equal with man, those times were gone by then. It meant that for someone who wanted to be like man could not anymore go to a convent and to be there without being inferior to man. It was already the period of patriarchization of the church, which indeed kind of was happening gradually. And I cannot imagine, honestly, I didn't study those cases, but it's a guesswork. I think that the original monasticism excluded this transvestitism because there was no need for that. Women could be equal with men just by going to a monastery, even within the patriarchal society like the Egyptian one. When even the kind of monastic community started imitating the patterns, the social patterns of the patriarchal societies, then transvestitism, I think, started happening. Well, that's my guess.
Did it happen the other way around? Did it ever happen the other way around?
Well, probably yes. Well, just read the Cameron,
I'm not sure which one.
I remember reading one life saints where a mother took her son to a convent.
And he lived there for how long?
Until he grew up, basically. There's no big detail, but I remember noticing it because it was the only time that it worked the other way around.
Well, it probably
There's
concentrates the
several
birth,
cases of fathers taking their daughters with them, or only one of a mother taking her son.
Father Cyril, I have a question that I actually want to ask you after your talk and forgot now. You reminded me of it again. This whole, okay, so the conversation about women being equal to men, right? All right. Where does the liturgical how does the liturgical aspect work in that? Because the governance of the monasteries, that all the abbesses, all that is fine. Okay, who served?
Well, certainly a priest served, but again, I think it was to be a priest in a monastic community permanently was also rather an exception at the time.
No, basically didn't exist. I remember reading a whole.
Economius wouldn't allow them.
I remember reading.
So who served?
Invited priests in both communities.
Okay,
in both
so
cases.
it's
That didn't last
kind of
very-
equality.
Well, of course,
Most of it.
we live in a fallen world.
Monasticism is a lay movement.
Yes.
It began as a lay movement, and in Orthodoxy, it remains a predominantly lay movement, unlike what happened in the Latin West, where you have whole orders that, everybody gets ordained as in the Jesuits and others, they're all ordained. But typically an Orthodox monastery, even a men's monastery, only ordains as many as it needs to fulfill its liturgical needs for that monastery. So very few are ordained. Monasticism, I did my Thessaloniki doctorate looking at the ontology of gender and Greek patristic exegeses of the creation accounts. And what I found was that monasticism is like an eschatological leap, because the Greek fathers did not think that we will continue to exist as male and female. I know this is shocking to me. It took me a long time to accept what they were saying. You're not required to. This is, I mean, one of the other great things about Orthodoxy is that we don't dogmatize very many things. And we definitely don't dogmatize our eschatology. But I did find enormous consistency, even though they talk about it in different ways. But that's that idea. So that when we look at this notion of unequal relationships between the sexes, this is seen as something that's part of our fallen condition. And as I always like to point out to people, if you look at Genesis 3 and all the consequences that are listed about the fall, we try to alleviate those in every other instance except that idea of male domination. We try to, we use medicine and technology to extend our lives, to make work less toilsome. We do everything we can to alleviate those other negative consequences of the fall. And so why should we say that one consequence is somehow God ordained? It is the artificial, the unnatural relation between the sexes.
Well, because we sanctified it, and then St. Paul really put a stamp on it, right?
Well, he didn't. I would say that he didn't really.
Well,
You know,
okay,
it's-
that's a favorite.
When you think of some of the examples that, already been mentioned, of, young women disobeying their parents to go into monasteries, or somebody like Perpetua, famous martyrdom story, also disobeying her father. And I tell my students, because I teach history of Christianity at Miami University, I tell my students, this is not the traditional values and traditional family
Of late antique society.
This was subversive values at the time. But I've been thinking about what Matushka Efrosinia said about this, the apocalyptic image. And one of the other things I think about when I teach the long spectrum of the history of Christianity is that, before the conversion of Constantine, or even afterwards, but, while the majority of people are still not Christians, how do people become Christians? You have to go through catechesis. Catechesis that lasted 3 years as kind of a norm, right? What happened if you committed a serious sin? You were basically kicked out and had to go through a pretty rigorous process of penance and things like this before you were admitted back into the church. And there was a sense in which, to be a Christian was like a real commitment and meant a real radical change to your life, and a real radical difference between the lives of Christians and those everybody else in society. But once the whole society gets converted so that everybody in society is a Christian, and a lot of people welcome that. They saw that as a good thing because this was a way to Christianize the world, right? Which isn't that what Jesus told us to do, right? Was to Christianize the world. But what happens is that, everybody's baptized as an infant. There's no rigorous process of becoming a Christian anymore. And the sort of sin question kind of gets watered down too, so that, then you have the private confession and stuff like this. And so the sense of the rigor of what it means to be a Christian it's really watered down. And so there's a question, is it better to Christianize everybody and hope that some emerge from that and are not just nominal Christians? Or is it better? And I think this tension played out in the Western Church, where you had those groups like the Anabaptists and stuff like this. So it's like either you're in or you're out, kind of stuff. But anyway.
Right, thanks a lot, Scott.
Any last questions or comments?
Maybe we'll continue tomorrow because part of this stuff about like the gender things and the role of women it does have there's a lot to be said, I think, about this, for freedom in the church and having a voice in the church, so. But it's 9:30, right?
Yep.
So tomorrow, when are we starting?
9 o'clock.
9. Thank you to everyone for coming and
Yeah,
thank you to Valerie. Thank you for your food today, Monica.
Yeah,
Thank you. And Natalie, thank you.
You're welcome.